My brother threw a heavy bag of rotting garbage at me on my birthday, laughing, while he called me the ultimate family mistake. He then handed me a commercial DNA test as a sick joke to prove I did not belong. He wanted to humiliate me in front of our wealthy guests. But exactly 1 month later, our family lawyer called an urgent meeting in a top-floor Chicago high-rise. When the official federal laboratory results were unsealed, my arrogant brother and my vicious parents turned absolutely ghost white. My name is Grace. I am 33 years old, and for my entire life, I was treated as an invisible burden by my own flesh and blood. If you have ever been crushed by the people who were supposed to protect you, let me know in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to hear exactly how I dismantled the corrupt empire of the people who tried to destroy me. The biting November wind sweeping off Lake Michigan was brutal as I walked up the long sweeping driveway of my parents' suburban Chicago estate. It was my 33rd birthday. I did not want to be here. I had not received a single text message or phone call from anyone in my family all day long. Not a single word of kindness had been offered to me. Instead, a formal digital summons had been emailed to me by my father's executive assistant, demanding my immediate presence before their annual autumn investor gala began. I wore a simple beige dress, which was the only decent piece of formal clothing I still owned that did not have frayed hems or faded fabric. I climbed the expansive marble steps leading up to the grand front entrance. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before pressing the illuminated brass doorbell. I could hear the loud, arrogant laughter echoing from inside the sprawling, multi-million-dollar mansion. The heavy mahogany door finally swung open. It was not the uniformed housekeeper who answered the door. It was my older brother, Austin. Austin was 36 years old and wore a custom-tailored Italian suit that easily cost more than my rent for an entire year. He stood squarely in the center of the doorway, completely blocking the entrance with his broad shoulders. He did not smile. He did not offer a basic greeting. His dark eyes swept over my simple beige dress with profound, unfiltered disgust. Before I could even speak to ask why I had been summoned, Austin reached his hand behind the massive doorframe. He pulled out a heavy black plastic trash bag. It was leaking a foul-smelling dark liquid from the bottom corner, holding the remnants of the kitchen waste from their lavish meal preparations. Austin swung his arm back and aggressively hurled the heavy bag of household garbage directly at my feet. The heavy plastic bag hit the hard limestone porch with a sickening wet slap. The thin material burst open upon violent impact. A disgusting mixture of wet coffee grounds, rancid cooking grease, and rotting food scraps splashed violently upward into the freezing air. The dark, oily sludge splattered across my beige dress, soaking instantly into the delicate fabric and completely ruining my only good pair of shoes. "Happy birthday, parasite!" Austin roared, his booming voice echoing across the pristine manicured lawn of the estate. He leaned against the expensive doorframe, shaking with cruel amusement as he watched the grease stains spread across my clothes. "Look at you, Grace. You are an absolute mess. You have always been the ultimate family mistake, and now you finally smell exactly like one too." I stood frozen on the porch, staring down at the filthy trash covering my feet. The freezing Chicago wind bit right through my ruined dress, but the physical cold was absolutely nothing compared to the icy humiliation radiating through my chest. I clenched my jaw, fighting the immediate urge to step backward. I was a certified corporate asset appraiser. My entire professional life was built on analyzing the true value of commercial properties, identifying hidden structural flaws, and evaluating worth. Yet the people who shared my DNA constantly treated me as if I possessed absolutely zero value. The sharp clicking of designer heels echoed from the grand foyer inside the house. My mother, Veronica, stepped into the doorway, standing right beside her precious golden son. She wore a stunning emerald green gown and a thick diamond necklace that caught the bright exterior porch lights. She looked down at the burst trash bag and the dark, foul stains covering my dress. Her perfectly sculpted face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated annoyance. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not reprimand her 36-year-old son for physically assaulting me with garbage. "Austin, what is all this horrific noise?" Veronica scolded, her voice dripping with sheer extreme irritation. She glared directly at me, as if I had intentionally come to her home to ruin her perfect evening. "Look what you did to the imported limestone porch, Grace. The catering staff just swept out here 10 minutes ago. Why must you always bring your chaotic, miserable energy to my beautiful home?" "I did not bring this mess." "Mom," I said, keeping my voice tightly controlled despite the fact that my hands were shaking with pure adrenaline and rage. "Your son just deliberately threw a bag of kitchen garbage at me." Veronica waved her manicured hand dismissively, entirely ignoring my factual statement. "You bring this upon yourself, Grace," she stated coldly, her eyes devoid of any maternal warmth. "You loudly claim to be a highly educated certified corporate asset appraiser. You hold advanced degrees and certifications, yet you show up to our estate looking like a desperate broken beggar off the street. You are an absolute embarrassment to our high social standing." I looked at my mother, refusing to drop my gaze. I refused to let her rewrite the reality of my situation. "I look like this because your beloved son deliberately froze me out of the corporate vendor network 2 years ago." I fired back, the agonizing truth finally spilling over. I was building a brilliant independent career as an asset appraiser. But Austin actively called every major commercial real estate firm in Chicago. He used the family company leverage to cancel all my existing appraisal contracts. He blacklisted me across the entire industry. He systematically destroyed my income stream and left me financially starving while you watched and cheered him on. Austin laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that grated against my ears like grinding metal. "You could not handle the big leagues, Grace," he mocked, taking a slow, arrogant sip from a crystal glass of expensive bourbon he was holding. "You were far too weak. I simply protected our family reputation by ensuring incompetent people do not represent our elite industry circle. You have been scraping the bottom of the barrel for 2 years because you are entirely useless to the corporate world." Heavy, aggressive footsteps sounded behind them in the foyer. My father George pushed his way to the front of the door. He was a towering man whose entire personality was built around aggressive corporate dominance and maintaining an illusion of absolute superiority. He looked at the trash scattered on the porch and then glared at me with absolute searing contempt. "Get this disgusting mess cleaned up immediately," George barked, aiming his rage entirely at me rather than his son. "The VIP investors from the East Coast are arriving in exactly 20 minutes. We are hosting a massive commercial networking event tonight that will secure our next quarter funding. I will not have my disgraced broke daughter loitering on my front porch, making us look like common trash to our business partners." "You called me here, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a low, tense whisper to prevent it from cracking. "Your executive assistant sent me a mandatory urgent summons to be here at this exact time." "I summoned you to tell you to stop using our family last name on your pathetic freelance appraisal applications," George sneered, leaning his large frame forward to physically intimidate me. "You are dragging our pristine corporate brand through the mud. You are a complete failure, Grace. You do not belong in our world, and you never have. Now get off my property before I have the estate security team physically drag you away from the gates." The three of them stood in the doorway, forming a unified toxic wall of profound hatred and arrogance. They had spent my entire 33 years of life treating me like an unwanted infection. They favored Austin unconditionally, excusing his ruthless behavior while constantly punishing me for simply existing in their space. Austin stepped forward, moving past our parents. He reached into the inner pocket of his expensive tailored suit. He pulled out a small rectangular cardboard box. The bright clinical packaging was highly recognizable. It was a commercial DNA testing kit from a highly popular genetic ancestry service. Austin did not hand the box to me politely. He aggressively threw it, pitching it hard so it hit me squarely in the center of my chest. The sharp corner of the cardboard stung as it struck my collarbone before falling to the concrete porch, landing right next to the spilled coffee grounds. "Take it," Austin commanded, a vicious, arrogant smirk spreading completely across his face. "Pick it up, Grace. I bet my entire executive bonus that you do not even carry our family bloodline. You are too weak, too pathetic, and too completely incompetent to share a single genetic marker with me or my parents. You are a genetic mistake. I demand you take that test. I want absolute scientific proof that you are just an illegitimate outsider, so we can legally cut you out of this family trust forever." George and Veronica did not stop him. They stood behind Austin, nodding in cruel agreement, eagerly waiting for me to break down in tears and run away crying into the freezing Chicago night. They wanted to break my spirit entirely. They wanted me to completely surrender to their abuse. I looked down at the commercial DNA testing kit resting on the freezing stone porch. I looked at the dark, oily stains ruining my simple dress. I felt the biting winter wind whipping through my hair, chilling my skin. I did not cry. The fear and the desperate need for their validation that had haunted my entire childhood and adult life completely evaporated in that exact second. It was replaced by a cold, highly calculated, absolute clarity. I slowly bent down. I ignored the foul-smelling garbage touching my ruined shoes. I picked up the small cardboard box, gripping it firmly in my right hand. I stood back up, straightening my spine to my full, absolute height. I looked my brother Austin directly in his dark, arrogant eyes. I offered him a slow, chilling smile that made his smug expression falter for just a fraction of a second. "I will take your test, Austin," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and dangerously calm. "Be very careful what you wish for." I gave my parents one final piercing look, turned my back on their sprawling mansion, and walked down the long, freezing driveway into the dark night. I carried the DNA kit like a loaded weapon. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the very instrument of their own total destruction. My brother threw a heavy bag of rotting garbage at me on my birthday, laughing, while he called me the ultimate family mistake. He then handed me a commercial DNA test as a sick joke to prove I did not belong. He wanted to humiliate me in front of our wealthy guests. But exactly 1 month later, our family lawyer called an urgent meeting in a top-floor Chicago high-rise. When the official federal laboratory results were unsealed, my arrogant brother and my vicious parents turned absolutely ghost white. My name is Grace. I am 33 years old, and for my entire life I was treated as an invisible burden by my own flesh and blood. If you have ever been crushed by the people who were supposed to protect you, let me know in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to hear exactly how I dismantled the corrupt empire of the people who tried to destroy me. I had barely taken 2 steps down the icy limestone path when Austin's voice cracked like a whip through the freezing November air. He was not about to let me walk away quietly in the dark. He wanted an audience for his cruel theater. "Do not take another step," Grace Austin barked, stepping off the porch and grabbing my shoulder with a harsh, violent grip. "You are not leaving this property with that kit. You are going to take the test right here, right now. I want to watch you do it. I want to make sure you do not fake the swab to pretend you belong in this family." At that exact moment, the heavy iron gates at the end of the driveway swung open. A sleek black town car pulled onto the estate, followed closely by a silver Bentley. The VIP investors my parents had been desperately waiting for were arriving. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed forward to open the car doors. High society elites stepped out into the freezing wind, pulling their expensive mink coats tight. They immediately stopped and stared at the bizarre scene unfolding on the front steps of the mansion. They saw a billionaire CEO and his socialite wife standing on their pristine porch alongside their wealthy son. And they saw me covered in rotting garbage holding a plastic DNA kit. Austin's face lit up with a wicked, malicious joy. He saw the arriving guests and instantly recognized the perfect opportunity to maximize my public humiliation. He did not lower his voice to keep the family drama private. He projected his voice across the manicured lawn, ensuring every single wealthy investor stepping out of their luxury vehicles could hear him clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Austin announced, waving his arm toward me like a circus ringmaster presenting a freak show. "Welcome to our autumn gala. Please step right up and witness the highly anticipated removal of a genetic anomaly. We are finally proving that this incompetent broke failure does not carry a single drop of our elite family blood." Several of the guests chuckled nervously, unsure if this was a bizarre performance art piece or genuine cruelty. My father George puffed out his chest, standing proudly next to his vicious son. He offered the guests a charming fake smile while shooting me a look of pure, unfiltered hatred. "It is true," George said loudly, adjusting his custom-tailored suit jacket. "We are executing a necessary corporate and familial restructuring tonight. We are securing the absolute legal proof we need to formally excise this parasite from our family trust. By the end of the business week, we will be officially scrubbing her from all our social registries and legal documents. She is an absolute liability to our corporate brand." My mother Veronica nodded vigorously in agreement, her diamond necklace catching the harsh security lights. She looked at a prominent real estate investor stepping out of the Bentley. "She is not one of us," Veronica declared, her voice dripping with venom. "We have carried her dead weight for far too long. Once this lab result comes back, we are completely washing our hands of her." The sheer audacity of their public cruelty was breathtaking. They were actively destroying my reputation in front of the very people I might one day need to appraise commercial assets for. They wanted to ensure I could never secure another lucrative contract in Chicago ever again. "Take the swab," Grace Austin commanded, crossing his arms over his chest. "Do it right now while everyone watches. Let us see the exact moment you officially become a legal nobody." I looked at the crowd of wealthy guests staring at me with a mixture of morbid curiosity and profound disgust. I looked at the dark, greasy trash stains soaking into my beige dress. I looked at the commercial DNA kit in my hand. I did not scream. I did not beg them to stop. The analytical side of my brain, the highly trained corporate asset appraiser, took complete control. I broke the situation down into raw data. My family was operating entirely on arrogant assumptions. They were exposing their massive vulnerabilities without realizing the severe legal ramifications of their actions. I broke the plastic seal on the cardboard box. The sharp tearing sound echoed clearly in the tense silence of the driveway. I pulled out the sterile swab and the biohazard collection tube. I maintained absolute, unblinking eye contact with Austin as I opened my mouth and firmly rubbed the swab against the inside of my cheek. I rotated it exactly as the instructions dictated, ensuring a flawless, viable genetic sample. Just as I was sealing the swab into the secure plastic vial, the heavy mahogany front door swung open wider. Gabrielle stepped out onto the freezing limestone porch. Gabrielle was 34 years old, and she was Austin's wife. She was a brilliant Black American woman who served as the chief risk officer for one of the largest commercial banks in the Midwest. She was sharp, analytical, and possessed an aura of serious, intimidating intellect that sharply contrasted with the flashy superficiality of my mother. She wore a perfectly tailored navy blue pantsuit, her posture immaculate, her expression an unreadable mask of corporate stoicism. Gabrielle walked to the edge of the porch, taking in the entire chaotic scene. She saw the burst trash bag leaking dark fluid across the expensive stone. She saw the foul-smelling grease soaking into my simple dress. She saw the wealthy guests laughing nervously in the driveway. And she saw her husband Austin standing over me with a look of pure sadistic triumph on his face. As a chief risk officer, Gabrielle spent her days analyzing catastrophic financial hazards, mitigating corporate disasters, and identifying toxic liabilities. She knew exactly how to calculate severe risk. And right now, looking at the sheer unhinged cruelty of her husband and my parents, she recognized a massive terminal vulnerability. She knew firsthand how deeply toxic this family truly was. She endured their subtle racist microaggressions and their elitist condescension every single day at the dinner table. She tolerated their behavior strictly to maintain her own strategic positioning, but she had absolutely no illusions about their moral bankruptcy. Gabrielle did not say a word. She knew that intervening vocally would only cause George to explode into a volatile public rage, which would jeopardize her own careful plans. But her silence was not compliance. Gabrielle locked eyes with me. Her dark, intelligent gaze burned with an intensity that cut right through the freezing wind. Her eyes radiated pure, unadulterated disgust for her husband. She looked at Austin, the man she had married, with a level of cold contempt that sent a sudden shiver down my spine. She recognized that he was not just a bully. He was a reckless, arrogant fool playing with explosive elements he did not understand. Without uttering a single syllable, Gabrielle stepped gracefully down the limestone stairs. She ignored Veronica's sharp warning about the freezing temperature. She walked directly up to me, completely disregarding the foul-smelling trash surrounding my feet. She opened her sleek designer clutch and pulled out a crisp, clean white tissue. Gabrielle discreetly pressed the tissue directly into the palm of my hand. Her fingers lingered against mine for a fraction of a second. It was a silent, heavily loaded pact of solidarity. It was her way of telling me she saw the abuse, she recognized the injustice, and she was entirely on my side. She gave me a single, nearly imperceptible nod before stepping back and folding her hands neatly in front of her suit jacket. I gripped the clean tissue, feeling a sudden surge of adrenaline mix with my cold, calculated resolve. I wiped a small splash of dirty grease off my wrist, maintaining my composure. I placed the biohazard tube into the prepaid return envelope and sealed the adhesive strip with a loud, definitive snap. I stepped forward, completely closing the physical distance between myself and my brother. I held the sealed envelope out toward him. Austin snatched the envelope from my hand, a victorious, arrogant grin splitting his face. He held it up like a massive, glittering trophy for the wealthy investors to admire. "There we have it, folks," Austin announced triumphantly. "The official garbage disposal of the family tree is now in motion." I did not back away. I stood my ground, looking up into his smug, cruel face. My voice was low, but it carried a deadly, chilling resonance that instantly wiped the smile off Gabrielle's face, not out of fear, but out of profound respect. "You are going to deeply regret activating this process, Austin," I stated, my words slicing through the frigid air like a sharpened blade. "You think you are cutting me out, but you just handed me the keys to the entire kingdom. You just signed your own execution order." Austin threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, booming sound of absolute supreme arrogance. He genuinely believed I was making empty, pathetic threats to save face in front of the investors. He thought he was entirely invincible. "Oh, I am terrified," Grace Austin mocked, wiping a fake tear of amusement from his eye. "I am absolutely shaking in my custom leather shoes." He turned away from me and flagged down a private commercial courier who was walking up the driveway to deliver the evening's catering invoices. Austin pulled $100 bill from his money clip and shoved it into the courier's chest, along with the sealed DNA envelope. "Take this directly to the priority shipping center right now," Austin commanded the confused courier. "Pay whatever rush fees are required. I want this genetic garbage processed at the federal lab at maximum speed. I want the results expedited." The courier nodded quickly, grabbing the cash and the envelope before hurrying back down the driveway. Austin turned back to me, his arms spread wide in a gesture of total victory. "Tick-tock," Grace Austin sneered. "Your days of pretending to be a member of this elite family are officially numbered. Now get off my property before I have the valets throw you into the street." I did not say another word. I gave Gabrielle one last brief look of mutual understanding. Then I turned my back on the sprawling mansion, the laughing guests, and the arrogant brother who had just sealed his own devastating fate. I walked down the freezing driveway, my head held high, my mind already processing the vast strategic possibilities. Austin laughed as I walked away, completely oblivious to the catastrophic chain reaction he had just initiated. He thought he was securing his absolute dominance over the family wealth. He thought he was throwing out the trash. He had absolutely no idea that he had just ripped the lid off Pandora's box. And when that box finally opened, the sheer destructive force of the truth would burn his entire fake empire straight to the ground. "Keep the application frozen exactly where it is, Gabrielle," I said, my voice smooth and utterly lethal. "Do not let them know the system flagged the forgery. Let them believe the trap is perfectly set. I'm going to make sure they walk right into it." I ended the secure call and slid the phone back into my tailored coat pocket. The freezing wind of the Chicago streets bit at my face, but I felt entirely impervious to the cold. The sheer adrenaline of the impending corporate warfare fueled my every step. I had barely walked 2 blocks away from the coffee shop alcove when my phone violently vibrated again. It was a high-priority automated calendar summons. The sender was the executive administrative desk of Apex Distribution. The subject line was simply labeled Mandatory Financial Review. The required attendees were George, Veronica, Austin, and myself. They demanded my immediate presence in the top floor executive suite. They were moving incredibly fast, attempting to lock their fraudulent narrative into place before the bank's internal deadlines expired. I turned on my heel and walked directly back toward the towering glass headquarters of my family's crumbling empire. I bypassed the security desk, swiping my visitor badge, and rode the private elevator up to the penthouse level. The heavy oak doors of the primary executive suite stood slightly open. I pushed them wide and stepped onto the plush imported carpet. My father George sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his large hands folded together in a posture of aggressive artificial authority. My mother Veronica stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. She wore a forced plastic smile that did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Have a seat, Grace," George commanded, pointing a thick finger at the rigid leather chair positioned directly across from his desk. "We need to handle a minor administrative oversight from your tenure as our lead appraiser 2 years ago." I did not sit down. I stood perfectly straight, keeping my distance. "I prefer to stand," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "What oversight exactly?" Veronica stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood perimeter of the office. "We are simply updating our historical compliance records," she stated, her tone dripping with fake maternal sweetness. "When you abruptly abandoned your duties 2 years ago, several physical asset ledgers were left unfinalized. We just need your signature on a standard handover protocol to clear the external audit requirements." George slid a thick, stapled legal document across the polished mahogany surface. He placed a heavy silver pen right next to it. "It is just a formality, Grace," George said, his voice adopting a low, dangerous edge. "Sign the bottom line and you can go back to your pathetic little freelance life. We will even cut you a check for $10,000 as a severance courtesy for your prompt cooperation." I stepped forward and looked down at the document. It took my highly trained analytical mind exactly 10 seconds to identify the catastrophic legal trap they had meticulously laid out for me. It was not a standard handover protocol. It was a backdated declaration of fiduciary liability. The document explicitly stated that during my final quarter of employment, I had independently authorized the acquisition of a massive portfolio of toxic commercial assets. It assigned me total absolute legal responsibility for a $5 million operational loss. They were trying to create a paper trail to justify the fraudulent $7 million commercial loan they had submitted to Gabrielle's bank. They wanted to use my pristine financial record as a human shield, ensuring that when the federal authorities inevitably investigated the missing capital, I would be the one facing decades in a federal penitentiary. I slowly picked up the silver pen. I rolled it between my fingers, feeling the cold, heavy metal. George leaned forward, a greedy, desperate anticipation lighting up his eyes. Veronica took a sharp breath, waiting for me to sign my own execution order. I dropped the pen. It clattered loudly against the mahogany desk, rolling off the edge and hitting the floor. "I am not signing this," I stated, my voice radiating a deadly, chilling calm. "This document is a backdated, fraudulent confession. You are attempting to assign me legal liability for a $5 million operational deficit that Austin generated through his disastrous cryptocurrency investments. You are committing blatant violations of federal corporate accounting laws. If you present this forged liability transfer to a commercial lender, you are committing federal bank fraud." George slammed his massive fist down on the desk, his face instantly turning a violent shade of purple. The fake diplomatic facade shattered completely. "You ungrateful, arrogant wretch!" he roared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You owe this family everything. You will sign that document, or I will personally ensure you never work in the commercial appraisal industry again." A dark shadow moved from the corner of the office. Austin stepped out from behind a heavy custom bookshelf, his arms crossed over his tailored Italian suit. He had been hiding in the room the entire time, waiting to deliver the final psychological blow. "You are in no position to negotiate, Grace." Austin sneered, a vicious, arrogant smirk spreading across his face. You think your little independent appraisal career is safe. You think commercial real estate firms want to hire a disgraced pariah who refuses to cooperate with her own family. He pulled his sleek smartphone from his pocket and tapped the screen, holding it up for me to see. The DNA test I forced you to take on the porch, Austin said, his voice dripping with absolute malice. The lab expedited the processing. I have the preliminary portal ready to go live. If you do not pick up that pen and sign the liability transfer right now, I am going to leak a highly publicized narrative to every major commercial real estate firm in Chicago. I will hire a ruthless public relations team to blast the internet with the story that you are an illegitimate bastard child. I will tell the entire corporate world that you are a genetic mistake who tried to infiltrate our wealthy family to steal our assets. I will completely destroy your professional reputation. No bank, no developer, and no logistics firm will ever trust an appraiser who has been publicly exposed as a desperate, illegitimate fraud. Austin stepped closer, invading my personal space. His aggressive posturing meant to break my resolve. Sign the paper, Grace. Take the $5 million in debt. Take the fall for the family, or I will digitally assassinate you before the sun goes down today. I looked at my brother, his face contorted with unearned superiority. I looked at my mother, who was smiling cruelly at Austin's vicious threat, thoroughly enjoying the psychological warfare. I looked at my father, who was already pulling another pen from his desk drawer, anticipating my total surrender. They truly believed they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought the threat of public humiliation would override my logical appraiser mind. I looked Austin dead in the eyes. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear of submission. Publish whatever you want, Austin, I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying whisper. But I will never sign a fraudulent confession. And you should be incredibly careful about initiating genetic warfare. You might not like the monsters you find hiding in your own closet. I turned my back on them and walked out of the executive suite, leaving the heavy oak doors wide open behind me. I ignored George's furious screaming and Veronica's hysterical threats echoing down the hallway. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the lobby button, my heart pounding with absolute raw adrenaline. The war had escalated far beyond simple corporate sabotage. It was now a fight for absolute survival. I exited the soaring glass headquarters of Apex Distribution and immediately descended into the subterranean transit tunnels of downtown Chicago. I bypassed the crowded train platforms and navigated through a maze of underground pedways until I reached a highly secure, dimly lit coffee shop hidden deep beneath the financial district. It was a discreet, brutalist sanctuary favored by corporate lawyers and off-duty traders seeking absolute, unrecorded privacy. The heavy concrete walls blocked all cellular signals, and the loud ambient noise of the commercial espresso machines masked any quiet, sensitive conversations. I spotted her immediately in a dark leather booth situated in the deepest, furthest corner of the room. Gabrielle wore a sharp, immaculate charcoal blazer, her posture radiating a terrifying, intense authority. As the chief risk officer of a major commercial bank, she moved through the world with absolute precision. Today, however, the usual restrained corporate mask had been entirely stripped away. Her dark eyes burned with a cold, calculated, profound fury. I slid into the booth across from her, keeping my briefcase securely on my lap. Did they try to force the signature? Gabrielle asked, her voice low and completely devoid of pleasantries. They tried to bully me into signing a backdated declaration of fiduciary liability. I confirmed, keeping my voice equally hushed. They wanted me to absorb $5 million in toxic operational losses to legitimize their loan application. Austin threatened to launch a massive public defamation campaign, using the DNA test results to destroy my appraisal career if I refused to act as their human shield. Gabrielle let out a sharp, bitter laugh that held absolutely no humor. She reached into her designer leather tote bag and pulled out a small military-grade encrypted hard drive. The heavy metal casing clunked softly against the wooden table as she slid it directly across the surface toward me. "I am done," Gabrielle stated, her voice vibrating with a suppressed, raw intensity that commanded absolute respect. "I have spent years sitting at their lavish dining tables, smiling politely, while George and Veronica delivered their endless stream of racial microaggressions. I have tolerated their subtle elitist insults about my background and my hair. I have watched them treat me not as an equal partner to Austin, but as a diverse corporate trophy they could parade around to show off their fake progressive social standing. I swallowed my pride for the sake of my marriage. But I will absolutely not tolerate financial treason, and I will not watch them destroy another innocent woman. I placed my hand over the encrypted hard drive, feeling the cold metal against my palm. "What is on this drive, Gabrielle?" "Everything," Gabrielle replied, her eyes locking onto mine with unwavering, fierce solidarity. "Austin is a careless, arrogant fool. He left his home office network completely unsecured. I bypassed his administrative protocols last night. That hard drive contains the real, unedited accounting ledgers of Apex Distribution. It holds every single fraudulent offshore routing number, every fake vendor invoice, and every deleted internal communication from the past 5 years. It proves definitively that George and Austin have been running a massive illegal tax evasion syndicate right under the noses of their investors." Gabrielle leaned forward, resting her arms on the table, her powerful presence dominating the small underground space. "They are planning to drain the last remaining operational capital dump, the catastrophic debt, onto your shoulders, and flee the jurisdiction. They view you as a disposable shield, and they view me as a convenient blind spot. They think we are too weak and too marginalized to fight back against their wealthy empire." I looked at the brilliant, powerful black woman sitting across from me. We had both been marginalized, abused, and deeply underestimated by the exact same toxic family. But together we held the absolute totality of their destruction in the palms of our hands. "We are going to burn their fake empire straight to the ground," I said, my grip tightening around the encrypted hard drive. Gabrielle offered a slow, terrifyingly cold smile. "We are not just going to burn it, Grace. We are going to make sure they are standing right in the center of the room when the roof collapses. Keep the application frozen exactly where it is." "Gabrielle," I said, my voice smooth and utterly lethal, "do not let them know the system flagged the forgery. Let them believe the trap is perfectly set. I'm going to make sure they walk right into it." I ended the secure call and slid the phone back into my tailored coat pocket. The freezing wind of the Chicago streets bit at my face, but I felt entirely impervious to the cold. The sheer adrenaline of the impending corporate warfare fueled my every step. I had barely walked 2 blocks away from the coffee shop alcove when my phone violently vibrated again. It was a high-priority automated calendar summons. The sender was the executive administrative desk of Apex Distribution. The subject line was simply labeled "Mandatory Financial Review." The required attendees were George, Veronica, Austin, and myself. They demanded my immediate presence in the top-floor executive suite. They were moving incredibly fast, attempting to lock their fraudulent narrative into place before the bank's internal deadlines expired. I turned on my heel and walked directly back toward the towering glass headquarters of my family's crumbling empire. I bypassed the security desk, swiping my visitor badge, and rode the private elevator up to the penthouse level. The heavy oak doors of the primary executive suite stood slightly open. I pushed them wide and stepped onto the plush imported carpet. My father George sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his large hands folded together in a posture of aggressive artificial authority. My mother Veronica stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. She wore a forced plastic smile that did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Have a seat," Grace, George commanded, pointing a thick finger at the rigid leather chair positioned directly across from his desk. "We need to handle a minor administrative oversight from your tenure as our lead appraiser 2 years ago." I did not sit down. I stood perfectly straight, keeping my distance. "I prefer to stand," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "What oversight exactly?" Veronica stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood perimeter of the office. "We are simply updating our historical compliance records," she stated, her tone dripping with fake maternal sweetness. "When you abruptly abandoned your duties 2 years ago, several physical asset ledgers were left unfinalized. We just need your signature on a standard handover protocol to clear the external audit requirements." George slid a thick, stapled legal document across the polished mahogany surface. He placed a heavy silver pen right next to it. "It is just a formality, Grace George," said his voice, adopting a low, dangerous edge. "Sign the bottom line and you can go back to your pathetic little freelance life. We will even cut you a check for $10,000 as a severance courtesy for your prompt cooperation." I stepped forward and looked down at the document. It took my highly trained analytical mind exactly 10 seconds to identify the catastrophic legal trap they had meticulously laid out for me. It was not a standard handover protocol. It was a backdated declaration of fiduciary liability. The document explicitly stated that during my final quarter of employment, I had independently authorized the acquisition of a massive portfolio of toxic commercial assets. It assigned me total absolute legal responsibility for a $5 million operational loss. They were trying to create a paper trail to justify the fraudulent $7 million commercial loan they had submitted to Gabrielle's bank. They wanted to use my pristine financial record as a human shield, ensuring that when the federal authorities inevitably investigated the missing capital, I would be the one facing decades in a federal penitentiary. I slowly picked up the silver pen. I rolled it between my fingers, feeling the cold, heavy metal. George leaned forward, a greedy, desperate anticipation lighting up his eyes. Veronica took a sharp breath, waiting for me to sign my own execution order. I dropped the pen. It clattered loudly against the mahogany desk, rolling off the edge and hitting the floor. "I am not signing this," I stated, my voice radiating a deadly, chilling calm. "This document is a backdated, fraudulent confession. You are attempting to assign me legal liability for a $5 million operational deficit that Austin generated through his disastrous cryptocurrency investments. You are committing blatant violations of federal corporate accounting laws. If you present this forged liability transfer to a commercial lender, you are committing federal bank fraud." George slammed his massive fist down on the desk, his face instantly turning a violent shade of purple. The fake diplomatic facade shattered completely. "You ungrateful, arrogant wretch!" he roared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You owe this family everything. You will sign that document or I will personally ensure you never work in the commercial appraisal industry again." A dark shadow moved from the corner of the office. Austin stepped out from behind a heavy custom bookshelf, his arms crossed over his tailored Italian suit. He had been hiding in the room the entire time, waiting to deliver the final psychological blow. "You are in no position to negotiate, Grace." Austin sneered, a vicious, arrogant smirk spreading across his face. "You think your little independent appraisal career is safe? You think commercial real estate firms want to hire a disgraced pariah who refuses to cooperate with her own family?" He pulled his sleek smartphone from his pocket and tapped the screen, holding it up for me to see. "The DNA test I forced you to take on the porch," Austin said, his voice dripping with absolute malice. "The lab expedited the processing. I have the preliminary portal ready to go live. If you do not pick up that pen and sign the liability transfer right now, I am going to leak a highly publicized narrative to every major commercial real estate firm in Chicago. I will hire a ruthless public relations team to blast the internet with the story that you are an illegitimate bastard child. I will tell the entire corporate world that you are a genetic mistake who tried to infiltrate our wealthy family to steal our assets. I will completely destroy your professional reputation. No bank, no developer, and no logistics firm will ever trust an appraiser who has been publicly exposed as a desperate, illegitimate fraud." Austin stepped closer, invading my personal space, his aggressive posturing meant to break my resolve. "Sign the paper, Grace. Take the $5 million in debt. Take the fall for the family, or I will digitally assassinate you before the sun goes down today." I looked at my brother, his face contorted with unearned superiority. I looked at my mother, who was smiling cruelly at Austin's vicious threat, thoroughly enjoying the psychological warfare. I looked at my father, who was already pulling another pen from his desk drawer, anticipating my total surrender. They truly believed they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought the threat of public humiliation would override my logical appraiser mind. I looked Austin dead in the eyes. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear of submission. "Publish whatever you want, Austin," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying whisper. "But I will never sign a fraudulent confession. And you should be incredibly careful about initiating genetic warfare. You might not like the monsters you find hiding in your own closet." I turned my back on them and walked out of the executive suite, leaving the heavy oak doors wide open behind me. I ignored George's furious screaming and Veronica's hysterical threats echoing down the hallway. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the lobby button, my heart pounding with absolute raw adrenaline. The war had escalated far beyond simple corporate sabotage. It was now a fight for absolute survival. I exited the soaring glass headquarters of Apex Distribution and immediately descended into the subterranean transit tunnels of downtown Chicago. I bypassed the crowded train platforms and navigated through a maze of underground pedways until I reached a highly secure, dimly lit coffee shop hidden deep beneath the financial district. It was a discreet, brutalist sanctuary favored by corporate lawyers and off-duty traders seeking absolute unrecorded privacy. The heavy concrete walls blocked all cellular signals, and the loud ambient noise of the commercial espresso machines masked any quiet, sensitive conversations. I spotted her immediately in a dark leather booth situated in the deepest, furthest corner of the room. Gabrielle wore a sharp, immaculate charcoal blazer, her posture radiating a terrifying, intense authority. As the chief risk officer of a major commercial bank, she moved through the world with absolute precision. Today, however, the usual restrained corporate mask had been entirely stripped away. Her dark eyes burned with a cold, calculated, profound fury. I slid into the booth across from her, keeping my briefcase securely on my lap. "Did they try to force the signature?" Gabrielle asked, her voice low and completely devoid of pleasantries. "They tried to bully me into signing a backdated declaration of fiduciary liability," I confirmed, keeping my voice equally hushed. "They wanted me to absorb $5 million in toxic operational losses to legitimize their loan application." Austin threatened to launch a massive public defamation campaign using the DNA test results to destroy my appraisal career if I refused to act as their human shield. Gabrielle let out a sharp, bitter laugh that held absolutely no humor. She reached into her designer leather tote bag and pulled out a small military-grade encrypted hard drive. The heavy metal casing clunked softly against the wooden table as she slid it directly across the surface toward me. "I am done," Gabrielle stated, her voice vibrating with a suppressed, raw intensity that commanded absolute respect. "I have spent years sitting at their lavish dining tables smiling politely while George and Veronica delivered their endless stream of racial microaggressions. I have tolerated their subtle elitist insults about my background and my hair. I have watched them treat me not as an equal partner to Austin, but as a diverse corporate trophy they could parade around to show off their fake progressive social standing. I swallowed my pride for the sake of my marriage. But I will absolutely not tolerate financial treason, and I will not watch them destroy another innocent woman." I placed my hand over the encrypted hard drive, feeling the cold metal against my palm. "What is on this drive, Gabrielle?" "Everything," Gabrielle replied, her eyes locking onto mine with unwavering, fierce solidarity. "Austin is a careless, arrogant fool. He left his home office network completely unsecured. I bypassed his administrative protocols last night. That hard drive contains the real, unedited accounting ledgers of Apex Distribution. It holds every single fraudulent offshore routing number, every fake vendor invoice, and every deleted internal communication from the past 5 years. It proves definitively that George and Austin have been running a massive illegal tax evasion syndicate right under the noses of their investors." Gabrielle leaned forward, resting her arms on the table, her powerful presence dominating the small underground space. "They are planning to drain the last remaining operational capital dump, the catastrophic debt, onto your shoulders, and flee the jurisdiction. They view you as a disposable shield, and they view me as a convenient blind spot. They think we are too weak and too marginalized to fight back against their wealthy empire." I looked at the brilliant, powerful black woman sitting across from me. We had both been marginalized, abused, and deeply underestimated by the exact same toxic family. but together we held the absolute totality of their destruction in the palms of our hands. We are going to burn their fake empire straight to the ground. I said, my grip tightening around the encrypted hard drive. Gabrielle offered a slow, terrifyingly cold smile. We are not just going to burn it, Grace. We are going to make sure they are standing right in the center of the room when the roof collapses. 1,600 words. We left the underground coffee shop and navigated back through the freezing pedways toward my modest downtown apartment. The contrast between my cramped living space and the multi-million-dollar financial crimes we were about to uncover was staggering. I locked the deadbolt behind us. I pulled the blinds shut to block out the harsh city lights. I booted up my primary appraisal workstation. It was a high-powered desktop I built specifically for rendering massive commercial real estate datasets and analyzing deep market trends. Gabrielle plugged the encrypted hard drive into the secure port. I ran a localized sandbox environment to ensure no tracking software could ping Austin's network and alert him to our investigation. The sheer volume of data on the drive was breathtaking. It was a chaotic digital graveyard of corporate fraud. We spent the next 6 hours sitting at my small kitchen table, fueled entirely by black coffee and raw adrenaline. We pored over the digital ledgers, meticulously tracking every single hidden transaction and matching it against public tax filings. As a certified corporate asset appraiser, I knew exactly how to trace the physical valuation of their warehouses. As a chief risk officer, Gabrielle knew exactly how to track the illicit flow of liquid capital. We cross-referenced the operational budgets against the actual vendor payouts. "Look at these outgoing wire transfers," Gabrielle instructed, pointing a manicured finger at the glowing monitor. George and Austin are not just falsifying the domestic revenue reports. They are actively liquidating the physical assets of Apex Distribution. They are selling off the delivery fleets through third-party holding companies and reporting the vehicles as depreciated scrap. They are purposely suffocating the business to extract every single cent of value before the creditors notice. I pulled up the routing numbers attached to the holding companies. I traced the digital breadcrumbs through a labyrinth of international banking codes. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs as the final destination account populated on the screen. The money was completely bypassing the standard corporate accounts. They are funneling the liquidated cash into a private offshore account located in the Cayman Islands, I said, my voice tight with absolute disbelief. But the account does not belong to George or Austin or even my mother. I highlighted the primary beneficiary listed on the offshore trust. "It belongs to Madison," I stated, reading the name aloud. Madison was my 25-year-old youngest sister. She was the ultimate spoiled princess of the family, completely oblivious to anything resembling actual work. She spent her days lounging at exclusive country clubs and posting photos of imported designer bags on social media. She was completely insulated from the corporate operations of Apex Distribution. She was the perfect unsuspecting vessel for illegal funds. "They are using Madison as the ultimate clean slate," Gabrielle realized, her dark eyes widening with profound horror. Because Madison has zero official ties to the corporate board, her international accounts are not subject to immediate corporate audits. George and Austin are packing her accounts with millions of stolen dollars. They are preparing to drain the last remaining drops of blood from the company. Once the money is secured offshore, they plan to declare Apex Distribution totally bankrupt. They will leave the hard-working employees destitute and the commercial creditors empty-handed while they flee the jurisdiction to live like royalty on a private island. Gabrielle left my apartment just as the sun began to rise over the Chicago skyline. She needed to return to the massive suburban estate she shared with Austin before he woke up and noticed her absence. She promised to call me on her secure line as soon as she arrived safely. I stayed awake, staring at the damning spreadsheets, feeling a terrifying mixture of triumph and dread. We held the literal blueprint of their criminal enterprise in our hands. But Austin was not asleep when Gabrielle arrived at their lavish home. He was sitting in the dark center of their sprawling living room. The only light in the massive space came from the glowing screen of his customized laptop resting on his knees. As Gabrielle walked through the front door and placed her keys on the console table, She immediately felt the suffocating toxic shift in the atmosphere. The silence in the house was heavy and deeply dangerous. Austin stood up slowly. He turned the laptop screen toward her. A bright red security alert blinked ominously across the display, casting a sinister hue over his furious face. "You think you are so incredibly smart?" Austin sneered, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. "You think because you wear a fancy suit and carry a banking badge you can outsmart me in my own house? I installed a secondary biometric trigger on my home office network yesterday morning. I received an automated alert the exact second my encrypted master directory was cloned, and the access log shows it was authorized using your specific banking security credentials." Gabrielle froze, her mind racing to calculate her survival strategy. She maintained her pristine posture, refusing to let him see her internal panic. She drew upon years of navigating hostile corporate boardrooms to keep her face entirely neutral. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about, Austin," Gabrielle stated, her voice perfectly level. "My banking credentials are automatically synced to our home network for remote server access. It must have been a false system ping generated by a routine software update." Austin slammed the laptop shut with a violent, echoing crack. "Do not play your pathetic corporate games with me," he roared, marching across the hardwood floor until he was standing mere inches from her face. "I know exactly what you did. You met with Grace. You downloaded my financial ledgers to help that illegitimate outcast build a case against her own blood. You betrayed your husband. You betrayed this entire family. You betrayed yourself." "Austin," Gabrielle fired back, the years of suppressed rage finally breaking through her calm exterior. "You are stealing millions of dollars from your own company. You are hiding behind your spoiled youngest sister to funnel cash into offshore accounts. You are a pathetic criminal masquerading as a successful businessman." Austin let out a loud, sharp laugh that contained absolutely zero humor. It was the laugh of a man who believed his wealth made him completely untouchable by the laws of basic human decency. He looked at his brilliant black wife with a gaze full of terrible racist condescension. "I am a visionary," Austin mocked, leaning forward to aggressively intimidate her. "And you are nothing but a diversity hire I brought into this family to make our corporate board look socially progressive to investors. You have zero power here, Gabrielle. You think you can use my data to destroy me? I will destroy you before you even reach the courthouse steps." He pointed a threatening finger directly at her chest, jabbing the air with absolute entitlement. "I will file for immediate emergency divorce," Austin threatened, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying hiss. "I will unleash a team of ruthless, high-priced lawyers who will drag your name through the mud. I will tell the family court that you are a completely unfit mother. I will claim you are suffering from severe paranoia and corporate espionage delusions. I have the highest judges in this county in my back pocket. I will strip you of full legal custody of Leo. You will never see our son again. I will throw you out of this mansion with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back. You will be a penniless, disgraced outcast just like Grace." Gabrielle did not scream. She did not beg for his mercy. She knew that showing weakness to a narcissist was a fatal error. She turned her back on her vicious husband and walked directly up the grand staircase, ignoring his aggressive shouts echoing behind her. She entered the master bedroom and locked herself inside the heavy marble bathroom. Her hands were shaking violently as she leaned against the cold stone sink. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, seeing the profound exhaustion, but also the unbreakable resilience of a mother fighting for her child. She pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed my secure number. I answered on the first ring. "Gabrielle, are you okay?" I asked, my heart hammering furiously in my chest as I heard her ragged breathing over the line. "I am fine," Gabrielle said, her voice cracking slightly before she forced it back into a steel column of absolute resolve. "But Austin knows. He caught the network ping. He cornered me in the living room and threatened to take full custody of Leo. He threatened to leave me utterly destitute and alone. He told me I was nothing but a pawn he used to make himself look good." A hot wave of protective anger washed over me. "I will not let him hurt you," I vowed, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. We have the evidence. We can go to the federal authorities right now and have them arrested for embezzlement. No, we cannot go to the authorities yet, Gabrielle replied, wiping a single tear from her cheek. Because Austin revealed something else while he was screaming at me. His arrogance made him sloppy. He bragged about his immediate escape plan. He knows the timeline has completely accelerated now that the data is compromised. He is not waiting for the end of the fiscal quarter to make his final move. What is he doing? I asked, grabbing a yellow notepad and a pen from my desk. He is planning a massive fire sale, Gabrielle revealed, her voice dropping to an urgent, desperate whisper. Austin and George are finalizing a contract to sell the Central Apex distribution land. They are selling the entire commercial lot to a massive downtown real estate developer. They are offering the property at a steeply discounted rate of $20 million for an immediate all-cash transaction. They are scheduled to sign the final binding paperwork next week. I stared at the notepad, my mind rapidly processing the catastrophic implications. If they secured $20 million in liquid cash, they could instantly wire it to Madison's offshore accounts. They would have the endless resources needed to flee the country, bribe high-level officials, and fund a brutal legal war against Gabrielle to take her son. Once that cash crossed international borders into the Cayman Islands, we would never be able to touch them. The authorities would hit a brick wall of foreign privacy laws. They would win. We cannot let them sign that contract, I said, my voice hardening with absolute relentless determination. If they get that $20 million, they will destroy your life and they will disappear forever. I know, Gabrielle said, her breathing steadying as her tactical brilliance took over the conversation. That is exactly why we are going to block the sale. You are a certified corporate asset appraiser, Grace. You know how these commercial real estate developers operate. You know the exact legal vulnerabilities of a rushed cash transaction. You know how to spot a fraudulent property valuation. We are going to walk right into that meeting and blow their entire getaway plan straight to hell. Exactly 1 week later, the private dining room at the Prime Cut Steakhouse in downtown Chicago smelled of aged leather-roasted garlic and $1,000 Cabernet. The room was heavily soundproofed, completely insulated from the bustling main dining floor. Austin stood at the head of the long, polished oak table, holding a crystal decanter. He poured a generous measure of dark red wine into the glass of Richard Kensington, the lead acquisition director for a massive commercial development conglomerate. My father, George, sat to Kensington's right, projecting the image of a relaxed, victorious billionaire. My mother, Veronica, sat gracefully opposite them, wearing a stunning diamond necklace and offering her most practiced high society smile. They were minutes away from executing a $20 million all-cash transaction. The contract resting in the center of the table represented their absolute salvation. It was the heavily discounted fire sale of the Central Apex distribution land. Once Kensington signed the bottom line, the funds would be wired directly into the corporate accounts, and Austin would immediately siphon the cash offshore to Madison's hidden Cayman Island trust. They were laughing. They were celebrating. They thought they had successfully escaped the burning wreckage of their own criminal enterprise. I pushed the heavy brass handles of the private dining room doors. The doors swung inward silently. I did not sneak into the room. I walked in with the commanding, untouchable presence of an apex predator stepping into a cage. I wore a sharp, immaculate slate gray suit. My posture was perfectly straight. I carried a sleek leather briefcase in my right hand. Austin froze mid-pour. The expensive red wine splashed over the rim of Kensington's crystal glass and stained the pristine white tablecloth. George dropped his fork. His jaw clenched so tightly a visible muscle jumped in his cheek. Veronica let out a sharp, shocked gasp, raising her manicured hand to her chest. I ignored my toxic family entirely. I walked directly up to the buyer. "Good evening, Mr. Kensington," I said, my voice smooth and projecting absolute professional authority. "My name is Grace. I am the independent corporate asset appraiser, assigned to verify the structural valuation of the Apex distribution headquarters before you finalize this acquisition." The room erupted into absolute chaotic fury. George slammed his massive hands down on the oak table. He stood up so fast his heavy leather chair scraped violently against the floorboards. What is the meaning of this? George roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. Security. Get the restaurant manager in here immediately. This woman is a corporate spy. She is a disgraced, disgruntled former employee attempting to sabotage a private business dinner. Veronica quickly stood up, clutching her expensive designer purse. Do not listen to a single word she says. Mr. Kensington. Veronica shrilled her voice, pitching into a hysterical, desperate tone. She is a bitter outcast. We fired her for severe financial misconduct. She is completely unhinged and obsessed with destroying our family legacy because she could not handle the pressure of our elite corporate standards. Austin quickly placed the crystal decanter on the table. He let out a loud, arrogant laugh, trying to mask the sheer terror radiating from his eyes. He desperately needed to regain control of the narrative before Kensington got spooked. Relax, Mom, Austin mocked, leaning casually against the table to project false confidence. She is just throwing a pathetic tantrum because her time is officially up. You see, Richard, my sister here is about to be legally permanently excised from our family trust. Austin pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. His mask of corporate professionalism vanished, replaced by the vicious, cruel bully I had known my entire life. We submitted a genetic test last month. Austin boasted, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. We finally decided to prove what we have known for decades. She is an illegitimate bastard. She does not carry a single drop of our elite bloodline. She is a genetic mistake my mother made the unfortunate error of taking pity on. The laboratory results are pending. She knows she is about to be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing, so she is staging this desperate, pathetic little stunt to extract a ransom. I did not flinch. I did not show an ounce of emotional pain at his horrific public insults. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the commercial developer. Mr. Kensington, I said calmly, opening my leather briefcase and pulling out a thick, bound dossier. I do not care about their toxic family delusions. I care about commercial liability. The land you are about to purchase for $20 million is currently facing catastrophic environmental zoning violations. Apex Distribution has actively suppressed 3 recent municipal audits showing severe soil contamination underneath their primary loading docks. If you sign that purchase agreement today, your firm will instantly absorb millions of dollars in federal environmental cleanup penalties. They are selling you a toxic liability. Kensington stared at the documents I placed on the table. He looked at the detailed municipal zoning maps and the suppressed environmental reports I had meticulously compiled using my elite appraisal credentials. Then he looked up at George and Austin. The wealthy developer was no longer smiling. The relaxed, celebratory atmosphere had completely vanished, replaced by a chilling, intense suspicion. In the world of high-stakes commercial real estate, trust was everything. And right now, Kensington was watching a family scream at their own daughter, calling her an illegitimate bastard and a corporate spy right in the middle of a $20 million transaction. Kensington slowly reached out and picked up his expensive silver pen. He did not sign the contract. He clicked the pen shut and placed it firmly inside his tailored suit jacket. I do not sign contracts in the middle of unhinged family circuses, Kensington stated, his voice radiating cold, absolute disgust. If there is even a fraction of truth to these environmental liabilities, my firm is withdrawing our offer entirely. My legal team will be conducting a full independent forensic review of your physical assets tomorrow morning. Until then, this deal is completely frozen. George opened his mouth to beg, to offer desperate assurances, but he was abruptly cut off. A loud, sharp ringing pierced the tense air of the dining room. It was Austin's cell phone. The device vibrated aggressively against the polished oak table. Austin ignored it, glaring at Kensington with furious desperation. The phone rang again. It was a highly distinct priority ringtone. Austin glanced down at the screen. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking physically ill. It was Mr. Henderson, the supreme executor and managing attorney of the late grandfather's Dynasty Trust. Mr. Henderson was a terrifyingly powerful figure who controlled the ultimate fate of the $50 million family empire. He never called after business hours unless it was a catastrophic emergency. Austin picked up the phone, his hands trembling slightly. "Yes, Mr. Henderson?" Austin answered, his voice losing all its previous arrogant swagger. The dining room fell dead silent. We could hear the faint, stern voice of the powerful lawyer leaking through the phone speaker. "I do not care what dinner you are attending, Austin," Mr. Henderson commanded, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "You, your father George, and your mother Veronica are to report to my top-floor law office immediately. I have just received an emergency courier delivery from the federal laboratory. The genetic testing you initiated has been officially processed and cross-referenced against the primary family trust database." Austin swallowed hard, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What do the results say, Mr. Henderson?" Austin asked, a sudden terrifying panic bleeding into his tone. "I am not discussing this over an unsecured cellular line," Mr. Henderson replied coldly. "The results trigger an immediate mandatory review of your late grandfather's original master will. Every single member of the family, including Grace, must be sitting in my conference room in exactly 30 minutes. Do not be late." The line went dead. Austin slowly lowered the phone. He looked at his parents, his eyes wide with profound, sickening terror. The trap I had patiently waited for was finally springing shut. The 30-minute drive from the prime-cut steakhouse to the towering skyscraper of Henderson and Associates felt like a suspended breath. My family scrambled out of the restaurant, abandoning the bewildered commercial developers without another word. Panic had initially gripped them, but by the time they reached the ground-floor lobby of the law firm, that panic had violently morphed into a manic, delusional arrogance. They stepped into this private glass elevator that shot up toward the 50th floor. The city lights of Chicago blurred around them as they ascended. In the confined space of the elevator, Austin completely managed to convince himself and his desperate parents that this emergency summons was actually their ultimate salvation. "Think about it," Austin reasoned, his voice bouncing off the glass walls with a frenzied, eager energy. "Mr. Henderson specifically mentioned the federal laboratory. He mentioned the genetic testing I initiated last month on the front porch. The results are finally in. We rushed the processing and it worked." George adjusted his expensive silk tie, his chest puffing out as the sudden realization washed over him. "The commercial land deal failing does not matter anymore," George declared, his voice regaining its booming, arrogant authority. "If the DNA test officially proves that Grace does not share our genetic markers, she is legally disqualified from the entire family registry. That means she is immediately stripped of any claims to the Dynasty Trust." "Exactly," Veronica chimed in, her eyes lighting up with a vicious, greedy excitement. She smoothed down her designer gown, completely forgetting the humiliation she had just suffered at the steakhouse. "If she is removed from the trust, all her interference is nullified. The $50 million estate will automatically default to the primary bloodline heirs. It will default to us. We will not just get the $15 million from a desperate land sale. We will get absolute control of the entire $50 million grandfather trust." They fed off each other's toxic delusions. They convinced themselves that my appearance at the restaurant was just a desperate final stunt of a woman who knew her fraudulent status was about to be exposed. They believed Mr. Henderson had called them to the top floor to officially hand them the keys to the kingdom. They were so utterly blinded by their own narcissism and greed that they completely ignored the cold, hard reality of the corporate trap closing tightly around their throats. The glass doors of the elevator slid open with a soft chime. George, Veronica, and Austin marched into the expansive, ultra-luxurious waiting room of the law firm. The reception area was an intimidating monument to legal power, featuring imported Italian marble floors, dark mahogany paneling, and sweeping views of the nighttime skyline. The receptionist, a stern woman in a tailored blazer, gestured toward a cluster of high-end leather sofas. "Mr. Henderson is finalizing some documentation in the main conference room," she stated politely but firmly. "He demands you wait here until he is fully prepared to receive you." Austin scoffed, rolling his eyes at the receptionist. He threw his expensive cashmere coat over the back of a leather chair and sat down, crossing his legs with extreme entitlement. He did not care about professional decorum. He felt completely invincible. He thought he was minutes away from becoming the sole heir to a $50 million fortune. "I hope she brings a heavy-duty trash bag to pack up her pathetic little apartment," Austin mocked his voice intentionally loud, ensuring the reception staff could hear his cruelty. Actually, she probably cannot even afford a trash bag right now. She is going to be sleeping on a park bench by tomorrow morning. I cannot wait to watch Mr. Henderson officially sever her from our family tree. I am going to frame the DNA results and hang them in my new executive office. Veronica sat next to her golden son, offering him a proud, vicious smile. She opened her designer handbag and pulled out a compact mirror, checking her makeup to ensure she looked absolutely flawless for her impending victory. Today is a historic day for our legacy, Veronica announced, her tone dripping with intense elitist superiority. Justice is finally going to be served. Your late grandfather was a brilliant man, but he was far too lenient with charitable causes. He allowed that girl to exist in our orbit for far too long. But wealth and power must be aggressively protected. The family fortune will now be strictly reserved only for pure-blooded heirs like you, Austin. We are finally cleansing the bloodline of its toxic impurities. George stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the tiny cars driving on the streets far below. He felt like a king overlooking his domain. He completely ignored the catastrophic financial crimes he had committed. He ignored the offshore accounts and the fake vendor payouts. He genuinely believed this genetic test was a magical eraser that would wipe away all his severe legal liabilities. She thought she could walk into my business dinner and threaten me, George snarled, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. She thought she could leverage fake environmental reports to scare away my investors. But she is nothing but an illegitimate fraud. When Mr. Henderson strips her of her surname today, I am going to personally ensure she is permanently banned from every commercial district in this city. She will be begging for scraps in the gutter. They sat in the waiting room for 20 excruciating minutes, marinating in their own supreme arrogance. They laughed loudly. They mocked my career. They plotted exactly how they would spend the $50 million they were so certain they were about to inherit. They fantasized about my absolute destruction. They built a towering castle of pure delusion, firmly believing they were the untouchable masters of their universe. They did not realize they were sitting directly on top of a massive ticking time bomb. The heavy double oak doors leading to the inner executive conference room suddenly clicked. The loud metallic sound of the heavy brass latch disengaging echoed sharply across the quiet marble waiting area. George, Veronica, and Austin immediately stood up. They smoothed their expensive clothes and pasted on their most confident, aristocratic smiles. They prepared themselves to walk in and receive the ultimate validation of their cruel, entitled existence. The heavy oak doors swung open wide. But it was not the receptionist who stepped through. It was not Mr. Henderson inviting them inside. I walked through the doorway. I was flawlessly dressed in a razor-sharp, bespoke midnight blue suit that commanded absolute, unquestionable authority. My hair was pulled back into a severe, immaculate style. My posture was perfectly rigid, projecting the terrifying calm of a woman who held the absolute power of life and death over their entire future. I did not look like a struggling appraiser. I looked like an executioner. The smug smiles instantly vanished from my family's faces. Austin took a sudden step backward, his confident swagger evaporating the second he made eye contact with me. Veronica gasped, her hand flying to her chest in shock. George simply stared, his jaw dropping slightly as he tried to process my dominating presence in the highest sanctum of their family law firm. But I did not walk out of that conference room alone. Flanking my right side was Gabrielle. My brilliant, powerful black sister-in-law wore an immaculate white structured blazer. Her dark eyes burned with intense, focused fury. She carried a thick black leather briefcase filled to the brim with devastating financial evidence. She stood beside me with unwavering, absolute solidarity, presenting a united, impenetrable front against the family that had deeply abused us both. Flanking my left side was a team of 4 unsmiling individuals wearing sharp gray suits and carrying heavy legal portfolios. They possessed the distinct, intimidating aura of federal auditors. They were not corporate lawyers. They were specialized government forensic accountants who dismantled corrupt empires for a living. They stood in perfect formation, creating a physical barrier of federal authority. The air in the waiting room completely vanished. The toxic confidence my family had been projecting just seconds ago was instantly violently crushed under the weight of the forces arrayed against them. Finally, Mr. Henderson stepped out from behind the heavy oak doors. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 60s, with sharp silver hair and a demeanor of absolute uncompromising legal severity. He did not offer George a friendly handshake. He did not offer Veronica a polite greeting. He stood in the center of the doorway looking at my family with profound, unadulterated disgust. In his left hand, Mr. Henderson held a thick manila envelope stamped with the highly secure seal of a federal genetic testing laboratory. In his right hand, he held a heavy leather-bound folio containing the late grandfather's original master will. Mr. Henderson looked directly at Austin. The powerful attorney did not raise his voice, but his words carried the devastating impact of a swinging executioner's blade. "You demanded an expedited processing of a genetic sample, Austin," Mr. Henderson stated, his voice echoing coldly off the marble walls. "You explicitly requested that this law firm cross-reference the results against the secure genetic database of the Dynasty Trust. You sought to use this biological data to aggressively terminate a beneficiary's standing." Austin swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. He nodded frantically, trying to force his vocal cords to work. "Yes," he stammered, his voice pitching high with sudden creeping panic. "Yes, I did. We need to officially remove her from the registry." Mr. Henderson slowly raised the sealed federal laboratory envelope. He held it up under the bright recessed lighting of the waiting room. "Your request was received and processed with the highest priority," Mr. Henderson continued, his eyes narrowing with cold, lethal precision. "The federal laboratory has delivered the absolute, unassailable genetic truth of this family. And I can assure you, Austin, the consequences of this biological revelation are going to permanently, irrevocably alter the entire landscape of your existence." I stood beside Gabrielle, my hands clasped loosely in front of my tailored suit. I looked at my father, whose face had turned a sickly pale gray. I looked at my mother, who was trembling violently in her designer gown. I looked at the brother who had thrown rotting garbage at me just 1 month ago. They thought they were walking into a coronation. They had absolutely no idea they had just walked straight into a massacre. "Step inside the conference room," Mr. Henderson commanded, stepping aside and gesturing toward the long mahogany table waiting in the inner sanctum. "It is time for you to face exactly what you are." I turned my back on them and walked back into the room, my heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. The trap was set. The doors were open. The total destruction of their fake empire was officially ready to begin. We took our seats around the massive polished mahogany conference table. The room was chillingly silent, save for the heavy sound of the door clicking shut behind us, sealing the trap entirely. I sat perfectly upright on one side of the table, with Gabrielle positioned immediately to my right. Her dark eyes were fixed on the opposite side of the room, where my family was practically forced into their chairs by the sheer intimidating presence of the federal auditors standing rigidly against the back wall. George gripped the armrests of his leather chair so tightly his knuckles turned a sickly shade of white. Veronica sat beside him, her breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps, her designer gown suddenly looking like a cheap costume. Austin slumped into the chair next to his mother, his initial arrogant swagger completely replaced by a frantic, darting paranoia. Mr. Henderson took his position at the head of the table. He did not sit down. He stood tall, looking down at the three of them with a gaze so filled with professional disdain, it made the air in the room feel physically heavy. He placed the thick leather-bound folio containing the original master will directly in the center of the table. Right next to it, he placed the sealed federal laboratory envelope containing the DNA results Austin had so desperately demanded. "I demand absolute total silence," Mr. Henderson commanded, his voice vibrating with an uncompromising legal authority that commanded immediate obedience. "You will not speak. You will not interrupt. You will sit there and listen to the precise legal mechanics of your own ruin." George opened his mouth, a desperate defensive instinct kicking in, but one sharp warning glare from a federal auditor instantly silenced him. He snapped his jaw shut, swallowing hard. Mr. Henderson unclasped the heavy brass lock on the leather folio. He opened the cover, carefully revealing thick parchment pages bearing the original signatures and notary seals from a decade ago. Your late grandfather was a titan of Chicago industry. Mr. Henderson began, his tone shifting into a deep, respectful register. He built Apex Distribution from a single delivery truck into a logistics empire based entirely on relentless hard work and unbreakable moral integrity. He was a man who understood the fundamental value of a dollar and the heavy responsibility of corporate stewardship. But above all else, he was a man who possessed a terrifyingly accurate perception of human nature. He saw people exactly for what they were. Mr. Henderson flipped to a specific tabbed section of the heavy document. 10 years ago, your grandfather sat in this very office. Mr. Henderson continued, looking directly at my father. He looked at you, George. He looked at the way you sneered at the warehouse workers. He looked at the way you carelessly spent company funds on luxury cars and country club memberships. He looked at your son, Austin, and saw a vicious, entitled parasite who lacked even a basic understanding of supply chain logistics. He knew with absolute prophetic certainty that the moment he died, the two of you would begin cannibalizing the company to fund your own pathetic greed. Veronica let out a quiet, indignant gasp, but a sharp look from Mr. Henderson forced her to bite her own tongue. To protect the foundational wealth of this family from your moral decay, your grandfather established a $50 million dynasty trust, Mr. Henderson stated, tapping his index finger against the heavy parchment page. This trust was designed to be a permanent, unbreachable fortress. It was structured to completely insulate the core assets of the empire from your reckless financial mismanagement. You thought you inherited absolute control when he passed away. You thought you were the undisputed kings of the board. You were entirely wrong. Mr. Henderson adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the dense legal text of the hidden addendum. The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint ticking of the expensive clock on the wall. George was sweating profusely, a thick bead of moisture rolling down his temple. Austin was staring at the leather folio as if it were an active explosive device. The master will explicitly details the absolute separation of the physical assets from the operational business entity. Mr. Henderson read aloud, his voice carrying a devastating finality. Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the Dynasty Trust clearly dictates that the entire central land parcel, the primary warehouse facilities, and the corporate headquarters of Apex Distribution do not belong to the operational company. They belong 100% to the Dynasty Trust. The color completely drained from George's face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out corpse. He stared at Mr. Henderson, his mouth hanging slightly open, his mind desperately trying to reject the catastrophic reality of the legal jargon. "Do you understand what this means, George?" Mr. Henderson asked, leaning forward over the table. "It means you are nothing but a commercial tenant. You do not own the building you sit in. You do not own the concrete your delivery trucks park on. You have absolutely zero equity in the physical infrastructure of Apex Distribution. You and your son are merely renting space from the trust." Austin let out a strangled, panicked sound. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his expensive suit jacket bunching awkwardly around his shoulders. "That means," Mr. Henderson continued, shifting his cold gaze directly onto Austin, "that the heavily discounted $20 million fire sale you have been desperately trying to negotiate with those commercial developers is a massive, legally actionable fraud. You cannot sell land you do not own. You cannot transfer a title that does not bear your name. The contract you were planning to sign at that steakhouse tonight is entirely null and void." Gabrielle leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. Her voice was smooth and laced with sharp analytical precision. "And that is exactly why the federal auditors are standing in this room," Austin Gabrielle stated, cutting through his panic with flawless legal logic. "When you attempted to initiate the sale of a protected asset held within a $50 million dynasty trust, you triggered a severe federal compliance review. You tried to quietly liquidate property that does not belong to you to secure $20 million in untraceable cash. You intended to use that cash to flee the jurisdiction before your mountain of toxic corporate debt collapsed. That is not just a desperate business move. That is grand larceny and federal tax fraud. George buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a miserable, defeated groan. His entire escape plan, his secret meetings with the developers, his desperate attempts to secure getaway cash, had just been completely, violently crushed. The $20 million lifeline he needed to survive had evaporated into thin air, leaving him drowning in a bottomless ocean of toxic debt. Veronica turned to George, her eyes wide with hysterical terror. "George, tell them this is a mistake," she pleaded, grabbing his arm and shaking him frantically. "Tell them you have the original deeds. Tell them we own the company. If we cannot sell the land, the creditors will seize the estate. We will lose the mansion. We will lose everything." George did not answer her. He could not. The absolute crushing reality of the situation had paralyzed his vocal cords. He knew the master will sitting on the table was ironclad. He knew Mr. Henderson possessed the highest legal authority in the state. They were completely, entirely trapped. But Austin refused to accept defeat. The golden child, the arrogant son who had never faced a single consequence in his pampered life, violently rejected the reality of his own destruction. His panic suddenly mutated into a blinding, aggressive rage. Austin jumped up from his leather chair. He slammed his fists down onto the polished mahogany table so hard the heavy wood rattled. His face twisted into a mask of pure feral fury. He pointed a shaking, angry finger directly at my face. "This is all absolute garbage!" Austin screamed, his voice echoing harshly off the glass walls of the conference room. "That will is 10 years old. It is an outdated, irrelevant piece of paper signed by a senile old man who did not understand modern business. You think you can use some hidden trust clause to steal my $20 million deal? You think you can just walk in here and take my company away from me?" Austin turned his furious, crazed eyes toward Mr. Henderson. "Read the rest of the trust rules, you pathetic old lawyer," Austin barked aggressively, pounding the table again. "Read the beneficiary requirements. The dynasty trust is strictly reserved for legitimate, pure-blooded descendants of this family. It is reserved for actual legal heirs. Grace has absolutely no legal rights to a single dime of that $50 million because she does not even belong in this bloodline." Austin gestured wildly toward the sealed federal laboratory envelope resting on the table right next to the master will. "I mailed that commercial DNA kit specifically to expose her fraud." Austin yelled, his voice cracking with desperate manic energy. "I demanded the federal lab cross-reference her genetic sample against the primary family registry. Open the envelope, Henderson. Break the seal right now. Show these federal auditors the scientific proof that Grace is an illegitimate bastard. Show them she is a genetic mistake. The second you read those lab results, her entire claim to the Dynasty Trust is completely annihilated. The land, the warehouses, the $50 million automatically default to me. I am the only true rightful heir. Open the results and banish this parasite from my family forever." Austin stood panting heavily, his chest heaving as he stared at the sealed envelope with a look of starving, absolute desperation. He genuinely believed that single piece of paper was his ultimate salvation. He believed it was his magical shield against federal prison and total bankruptcy. I sat perfectly still. I did not flinch. I did not defend myself against his unhinged screaming. I simply looked at my brother with a cold, terrifying calm, waiting for the final, devastating drop. Mr. Henderson did not yell back. He did not call security to restrain Austin. He slowly reached out and picked up the sealed federal laboratory envelope. He held it in his hands, looking at the red, urgent processing stamps decorating the front. Then Mr. Henderson slowly raised his eyes and looked at Austin. The powerful veteran attorney did not look angry. He looked at the 36-year-old man standing across from him with an expression of profound, chilling, absolute pity. It was the look a judge gives a condemned man who has just willingly placed his own head inside a loaded guillotine. "You were incredibly eager to expedite this genetic testing." "Austin," Mr. Henderson said, his voice dropping to a low, deadly whisper that instantly froze the blood in Austin's veins. You aggressively demanded we rush this process. You bullied your sister on the front porch of your estate, and you proudly mailed this swab to destroy her life. Mr. Henderson placed his hand over the sealed flap of the envelope, his fingers gripping the tear strip. You thought this envelope contained your absolute salvation, Mr. Henderson stated, his eyes locking onto Austin's terrified face with merciless precision. You have absolutely no idea that your blinding, arrogant cruelty just triggered your own execution. Mr. Henderson gripped the edge of the secure tear strip. With one swift, definitive motion, he ripped the heavy cardboard envelope open. The harsh sound of tearing paper echoed like a gunshot in the dead silent conference room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of documents. The paper was heavy and bore the unmistakable raised watermarks of the highest federal genetic testing laboratory in the country. This was not a cheap over-the-counter mail and kit result. This was a federally authenticated biological decree that carried absolute, undeniable legal weight. Austin leaned so far forward in his leather chair he was practically falling out of it. His eyes were wide with a frantic, starving desperation. He was waiting for the final word that would legally banish me from the empire. George mirrored his son, staring at the documents with equal anticipation. Mr. Henderson placed the stack of papers on the mahogany table. He slowly flipped open the cover page, revealing the primary genetic analysis. He adjusted his glasses, looking down at the dense rows of scientific data. The laboratory processed the genetic sample retrieved from Grace. Mr. Henderson began, his voice echoing with absolute surgical precision. Per your explicit instructions, Austin, they ran a full comparative analysis against the Master Biological Registry of the Dynasty Trust. They cross-referenced her DNA against the genetic profiles of both George and Veronica, which have been securely on file since the trust was established a decade ago. Mr. Henderson looked up from the paper, his eyes locking directly onto George. The results are absolutely conclusive, Mr. Henderson stated. The federal laboratory confirms with 100% scientific certainty that Grace is the direct biological daughter of George and Veronica. There is zero margin for error. She is a perfect genetic match to both of her parents. The room fell into a stunned, paralyzing silence. Austin opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His brain simply could not process the information. He had built his entire identity around the absolute certainty that I was an illegitimate outsider. He had thrown garbage at me and mocked me based entirely on that single vicious assumption. That is impossible. Austin finally stammered, his voice weak and trembling. That test is flawed. She does not look like us. She does not act like us. You have to run the test again. She must have tampered with the swab. She did not tamper with anything, Mr. Henderson fired back, his voice rising with powerful authority. I watched the courier chain of custody myself. Grace is your biological sister, Austin. She is a fully legitimate heir to this family. George sat perfectly still, his eyes darting between me and the federal documents. The realization that he had spent 33 years actively destroying and abusing his own legitimate flesh and blood was slowly beginning to crack his arrogant facade. But Grace is not the reason I summoned you to this top-floor office, Mr. Henderson continued, his tone darkening significantly. He reached down and slowly turned to the second page of the federal laboratory report. The top of the page was stamped with a massive red warning label that read, "System Anomaly Detected." When you demanded an expedited biological sweep of the Dynasty Trust Registry, Austin, you triggered an automatic federal security protocol, Mr. Henderson explained, looking down at the red ink. The laboratory algorithm does not simply check one isolated sample. It runs a comprehensive baseline verification of every single living heir currently listed in the trust database to ensure the entire registry is structurally sound before authorizing any legal removals. The system automatically audited your genetic profile, Austin. It also audited your sister, Madison. Veronica let out a sharp, terrifying gasp. It was not a gasp of surprise. It was the horrific, suffocating sound of a woman whose deepest, darkest secret had just been violently dragged into the light. She grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning completely white, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs. Mr. Henderson ignored her panic. He kept his eyes locked onto Austin, delivering the absolute fatal blow with merciless clarity. The federal cross-referencing system triggered a catastrophic biological anomaly. Mr. Henderson read from the report, his voice slicing through the room like a freshly sharpened scalpel. The laboratory confirms with 100% certainty that you, Austin, share absolutely zero genetic markers with the late grandfather. You share zero genetic markers with George. Austin stopped breathing. The color drained from his face so fast he looked as though he had been physically struck. Mr. Henderson turned the page once more. The same results apply to your youngest sister, Madison. She shares zero genetic markers with George. Both you and Madison share maternal DNA with Veronica, but your paternal lineage is completely entirely foreign to this family tree. The absolute horrifying truth crashed down upon the conference room with the destructive force of a falling skyscraper. The entire family legacy was a massive, disgusting lie. Veronica had engaged in multiple affairs decades ago. She had become pregnant by other men and had intentionally passed those illegitimate children off as the golden heirs of a billionaire dynasty. She had manipulated George into giving his vast fortune his name and his unconditional love to two bastards while systematically joining him in abusing and exiling Grace, the only child who actually carried his blood. Grace is not the genetic mistake, Mr. Henderson stated, looking directly at Veronica, who was now violently shaking in her chair. Grace is the only true pure-blooded descendant of this entire family empire. You, Austin, and your sister Madison are the outsiders. You are the illegitimate intruders. Veronica completely collapsed. Her rigid high society posture shattered instantly. She slumped down into her heavy leather chair, her chin dropping to her chest, a sickly, ghostly white pallor washing over her carefully made-up face. She looked like a deflated, broken shell. The diamond necklace around her throat suddenly looked like a heavy, suffocating chain. She could not speak. She could not defend herself. The federal paper trail was absolute and undeniable. For 5 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the room was Veronica breathing in ragged, hyperventilating gasps. George sat frozen in his chair, staring at the woman he had been married to for nearly 4 decades. His brain was misfiring, entirely unable to process the magnitude of the betrayal. He had handed the keys of his father's logistics empire to a son who was not even his own. He had funded the lavish lifestyle of a daughter who shared none of his blood. Then Austin completely snapped. The total annihilation of his identity, his wealth, and his unearned superiority violently broke his mind. He let out a primal, guttural scream of absolute denial. He lunged across the wide mahogany table, his hands violently swiping at the federal laboratory reports. He wanted to tear the papers to shreds. He wanted to physically destroy the scientific evidence that proved he was nothing but an illegitimate fraud. He never reached the documents. The federal auditors standing against the back wall moved with terrifying lightning-fast precision. Before Austin could even grasp the edge of the heavy paper, 2 agents lunged forward. They grabbed Austin by the shoulders and slammed him face first into the polished mahogany wood. The impact was brutally loud. Austin thrashed and kicked, screaming hysterically, but the highly trained agents pinned his arms effortlessly against his back, rendering him completely immobilized. "Let me go!" Austin roared, his face pressed hard against the table, spittle flying from his lips. "It is a lie. It is a fabricated lie to steal my company. I am the primary heir. I am the son." He twisted his neck, frantically looking toward his mother, who was currently sobbing uncontrollably in her chair. "Mom," Austin screamed, his voice cracking with pure, pathetic desperation. "Mom, tell them. Tell them it is a mistake. Tell George the laboratory is wrong. Tell them I am your legitimate son. Tell them I belong in this family. Please, Mom, say something." But Veronica did not look at him. She could not bring herself to meet the terrified, desperate eyes of the illegitimate son she had weaponized against her own family. She sat paralyzed, staring blankly at the floorboards, tears ruining her expensive makeup and dripping onto her silk designer dress. She just continued to sob, a pathetic, wretched sound of total absolute guilt. George slowly turned his head. He looked away from the screaming man pinned to the table. He looked directly at Veronica. The billionaire patriarch, who had spent his entire life projecting aggressive dominance, was currently trembling with a terrifying silent rage. His face darkened into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He was finally looking at the true monster of the family. He realized he had destroyed his own legitimate daughter just to protect the parasitic offspring of his wife's secret betrayals. Austin continued to scream and thrash against the federal agents, begging his mother to rewrite a reality that was already set in stone. The fake empire they had built on a foundation of lies was officially burning to the ground right in front of my eyes, and the flames were only just beginning to spread. The federal agents hauled Austin backward, forcing him down into his leather chair, but keeping a firm grip on his shoulders to prevent another violent outburst. Mr. Henderson did not even blink at the physical struggle. He simply reached out and placed his hand flat against the heavy leather-bound folio containing the late grandfather's original master will. The room was still vibrating with the shock of Veronica's infidelity, but the supreme executor was not finished. The legal execution had a second phase, and it was designed to be absolute. "I need everyone to focus," Mr. Henderson commanded, his voice easily cutting through Veronica's pathetic sobbing and Austin's ragged breathing. "The biological reality of this family is a profound tragedy, but it is not the mechanism that legally strips the current beneficiaries of their standing. Your grandfather anticipated bad actors. He anticipated greed. And to protect the integrity of his legacy, he installed a highly specific legal tripwire deep within the dynasty trust." Mr. Henderson turned past the asset allocation pages and stopped at a section highlighted with thick red ink. "10 years ago, your grandfather instructed me to draft a strict in terrorem clause," Mr. Henderson stated, tracing the heavy text with his index finger. "For those unfamiliar with trust law, an in terrorem clause is a severe anti-contest and anti-defamation protocol. It is a legal trap designed to instantly punish any beneficiary who attempts to maliciously disrupt the established family structure. But your grandfather made his clause incredibly specific. He knew the exact kind of cruelty this family was capable of inflicting." Mr. Henderson looked directly at Austin, who was now shaking visibly under the grip of the federal agents. "The clause dictates that if any formally recognized member of this family initiates a biological test or publicly attempts to degrade, humiliate, or disinherit another member of the bloodline to steal their inheritance, the aggressor will be instantly entirely stripped of their trust rights," Mr. Henderson read aloud. "The penalty is immediate. There is no grace period. There is no appeals process. The moment the malicious intent is formally registered, the aggressor forfeits 100% of their standing in the dynasty trust." Austin stopped struggling against the agents. His eyes widened as the catastrophic legal reality of what he had done finally penetrated his panic. He realized his own supreme arrogance was the exact key that locked his prison cell. "You did not just bully your sister in private, Austin," Mr. Henderson said, his voice radiating a chilling, unyielding authority. "You aggressively forced a commercial DNA test onto Grace in front of wealthy arriving guests. You publicly declared your explicit intention to use biological evidence to legally excise her from the family trust. And then you completely sealed your own fate by mailing that sample directly to my law firm with a formal written demand to cross-reference it against the dynasty database. I sat perfectly still, watching the arrogant brother who had terrorized me my entire life finally realize the magnitude of his own stupidity. He had built the gallows, tied the noose, and willingly placed his own neck inside it. By officially submitting that test to harm Grace, you legally activated the in terrorem trap," Mr. Henderson declared, delivering the absolute final verdict. "Your actions, combined with the undeniable biological proof that you are an illegitimate intruder, trigger an immediate total reallocation of all trust assets. You, Austin, are completely permanently stripped of every single dime." Austin let out a hollow, wheezing gasp. His chest caved inward, as if the oxygen had been vacuumed out of his lungs. But the punishment did not stop with Austin. Mr. Henderson turned his severe gaze toward George and Veronica. Because you, George, and you, Veronica, actively encouraged this malicious public defamation and stood by while Austin attempted to steal the rightful inheritance of your only true biological daughter. You are classified as complicit under the exact wording of the clause, Mr. Henderson continued. Your rights to manage the operational lease of the commercial property are hereby entirely revoked. George stared at the supreme executor, his jaw slack, his mind completely overloaded by the sheer volume of his losses. The entire $50 million Dynasty Trust, Mr. Henderson, announced, his voice echoing with absolute undeniable finality, is immediately and solely transferred to Grace. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Grace is the only legitimate, pure-blooded heir to this family empire, Mr. Henderson stated, gesturing toward where I sat calmly beside Gabrielle. She now possesses absolute unshielded ownership of the Central Apex distribution land. She owns the massive warehouses. She owns the corporate headquarters. And because she holds advanced federal certifications as a corporate asset appraiser, she possesses the exact legal and professional authority required to immediately liquidate or restructure those assets, however she sees fit. I looked at my family. The beige dress covered in rotting garbage felt like a lifetime ago. I was no longer the invisible burden. I was no longer the outcast begging for a seat at their table. I owned the table. I owned the building the table sat inside. I held their entire existence in the palm of my hand. Austin was completely broken. He stared blankly at the mahogany wood, his mind shattered by the realization that his own arrogance had cost him a $50 million fortune. Veronica continued to weep, her face buried in her hands, entirely unable to cope with the public destruction of her elite high society facade. But it was George who finally reacted. The billionaire patriarch had sat in stunned silence for the past 20 minutes, absorbing blow after catastrophic blow. He had lost his $20 million commercial land deal. He had lost his operational headquarters. He was facing federal prison for massive tax evasion and fraudulent bank loans. But the absolute heaviest blow was the horrifying biological truth that had just been unsealed. George slowly turned his head, his eyes locked onto Veronica. The realization of his entire wasted life crashed down upon him with the force of a freight train. For 33 years, he had treated me, his only actual biological child, like absolute garbage. He had starved me financially. He had cheered while Austin threw rotting kitchen waste at me on my birthday. He had actively conspired to frame me for $5 million in toxic corporate debt. He had done all of this to protect and elevate a son who was nothing but a bastard born from his wife's secret betrayals. He had funded the lavish, luxurious lifestyle of Madison, a spoiled, arrogant girl who did not share a single drop of his blood. He had bought them sports cars and penthouse apartments while I struggled to pay rent. George had destroyed his own true legacy to build a fake empire for another man's children. The silent, trembling rage that had been building inside George suddenly erupted. His face twisted into a terrifying mask of pure primal violence. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. He let out a deafening roar of absolute, unfiltered hatred that shook the glass walls of the conference room. "You ruined my life," George screamed, lunging across the heavy mahogany table. He completely ignored the federal auditors. He ignored Mr. Henderson. He threw his massive body weight forward, his large hands reaching directly for Veronica. He crashed into her heavy leather chair, knocking it backward. Veronica let out a piercing, terrified shriek as George's hands violently clamped down around her throat. He tackled her to the polished floorboards, the sheer momentum sending them crashing against the base of the conference table. George squeezed her throat with lethal, desperate force, his eyes wild and completely unhinged. He wanted to destroy the woman who had manipulated him, who had made him a fool, who had cost him his entire $50 million empire. "You lied to me!" George roared, his voice cracking with homicidal fury as he choked her. "You made me hate my own daughter. You made me give everything to your pathetic bastards. I will kill you." Veronica thrashed wildly beneath him, her hands clawing desperately at his face, her expensive diamond necklace biting sharply into her skin under the pressure of his grip. Her face began to turn a terrifying shade of purple as the oxygen was violently cut off. Absolute chaos exploded inside the executive conference room. The federal auditors immediately released Austin and scrambled across the room to intercept the violently escalating assault. Mr. Henderson shouted for building security, his professional demeanor breaking under the sudden physical danger. Gabrielle grabbed my arm and pulled me back from the table, putting safe distance between us and the violent brawl erupting on the floor. "Get off her!" the lead federal agent shouted, grabbing George by the shoulders and pulling backward with all his strength. But George was fueled by decades of suppressed rage and the adrenaline of total financial ruin. He clung to Veronica's throat, refusing to let go. Two more agents threw themselves into the struggle, grabbing George's arms and violently prying his thick fingers away from his wife's neck. They dragged him backward off her thrashing body, pinning him hard against the carpeted floor. Veronica rolled onto her side, gasping desperately for air, coughing and gagging as she clutched her bruised throat. Her immaculate designer gown was torn, her hair was a chaotic mess, and her makeup was completely smeared across her face. She looked exactly like the pathetic broken fraud she truly was. George continued to scream and thrash against the federal agents, cursing Veronica and cursing Austin, who was cowering in his chair, completely paralyzed by the violence. I stood in the corner of the room watching the people who had abused me tear each other to absolute pieces. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel fear. I simply watched the inevitable implosion of a toxic empire that had been built on a foundation of lies, arrogance, and pure cruelty. The fire they had started was finally consuming them alive. The heavy breathing of the federal auditors and George's muffled curses filled the shattered atmosphere of the executive conference room. The billionaire patriarch was firmly pinned against the carpeted floor by two highly trained agents, his face pressed into the fibers as he continued to spew pure venom at his gasping wife. Veronica remained curled on her side, clutching her deeply bruised throat. Her expensive emerald designer gown was torn and heavily wrinkled, her high society dignity entirely eradicated in a matter of seconds. Austin sat frozen in his leather chair, his eyes darting frantically around the room, completely unable to process the total implosion of his reality. He watched his father try to murder his mother right in front of him, realizing the protective, wealthy bubble he had lived in his entire life was actually a highly volatile war zone built entirely on vicious lies. While the toxic family tore each other apart on the floor of the highest legal office in the city, my brilliant sister-in-law decided it was the perfect moment to deliver her own lethal strike. Gabrielle stepped forward. She moved away from my side and walked deliberately toward the center of the massive mahogany conference table. The chaos happening just a few feet away did not disrupt her pristine composure for a single second. Her posture was immaculate. Her white structured blazer remained perfectly crisp, reflecting the terrifyingly cold authority of a woman who had meticulously calculated every single variable of this execution. She looked down at the pathetic, cowering form of her husband with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. Gabrielle lifted the thick, black leather briefcase she had carried into the room. She placed it squarely on the polished wood right next to the original master will and the unsealed genetic laboratory reports. She snapped the brass locks open with two sharp, definitive clicks. The metallic sound was incredibly loud in the tense room. She reached inside and pulled out a massive, heavily bound file. It was easily 500 pages of densely packed financial data. Gabrielle raised the thick stack of documents and threw it directly onto the mahogany table. The heavy file slammed against the wood with a loud explosive thud that made Austin flinch violently in his chair. "You thought you were a visionary, Austin?" Gabrielle stated, her voice cutting through the lingering chaos like a surgical blade. "You thought you could run a massive illegal tax evasion syndicate right under the noses of your investors and your family. You thought you were invincible because you had a rich father to cover your tracks. But your father is not a billionaire anymore. He is an illegitimate fraud just like you. And you are just a sloppy, arrogant amateur playing a dangerous game you do not even remotely understand." Austin stared at the massive file, his chest heaving with fresh terror. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice cracking pathetically. He recognized the specific red binding tabs his home office printer used. That is your complete financial autopsy, Gabrielle announced, her dark eyes boring directly into his soul. That file contains the real unedited accounting ledgers of Apex Distribution. It contains every single fraudulent offshore routing number you set up in the Cayman Islands. It contains the fake vendor invoices, the suppressed environmental audits, and the digital receipts showing exactly how you and George siphoned millions of dollars of operational capital into Madison's private trust accounts to hide your catastrophic cryptocurrency losses. Austin violently recoiled, his back hitting the leather chair as if the file were actively radiating extreme heat. He looked at Gabrielle with a mixture of sheer panic and profound betrayal. He simply could not comprehend how his brilliant black wife, the woman he had treated as a convenient diversity prop and a silent background character, had managed to completely outmaneuver him. "You stole my data," Austin gasped, his hands trembling as he pointed a shaking finger at her. "You accessed my home network. You cannot use that. It is illegally obtained evidence. Any lawyer in the country will have that thrown out of court immediately. I will sue you. I will have you arrested for corporate espionage." Gabrielle let out a cold, sharp laugh that held absolutely zero humor. It was a sound of pure tactical superiority. "You are truly an idiot, Austin," Gabrielle replied, shaking her head slowly. "I am the chief risk officer for one of the largest commercial banking institutions in the Midwest. I do not make sloppy legal mistakes. I did not just print those documents and bring them to a family meeting to argue with you. I took that raw data and I packaged it into a flawless, airtight legal dossier. And then I handed it directly to the federal government." George stopped struggling against the federal agents on the floor. He turned his head, looking up at Gabrielle with wide, terrified eyes. Veronica let out a fresh, miserable sob, realizing the nightmare was far from over. The commercial land they had lost to me was only the beginning of their ruin. I submitted every single page of those fraudulent financial records to the Internal Revenue Service. Gabrielle declared, her voice echoing with absolute, undeniable power. "I submitted them this morning as an official protected federal whistleblower. I provided the Criminal Investigation Division with the exact coordinates of your offshore syndicate. I gave them the routing numbers, the hidden IP addresses, and the forged loan applications you submitted to my bank." "No!" Austin screamed, grabbing his hair and pulling it in a frantic, manic gesture. "No, you did not. You are bluffing. You would never do that to your own husband." "I absolutely did it," Gabrielle fired back, her tone dropping to a deadly, chilling register. "I did it because I am thoroughly exhausted by the racist microaggressions I endure at your family dinner table. I did it because I refuse to let you financially assassinate Grace to cover up your pathetic failures. I did it because you threatened to take my son away from me. You threatened to leave me destitute on the street. So I made sure the federal authorities dismantled your entire infrastructure before you could even pack a single bag." Austin scrambled to reach into his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out his sleek smartphone and his black leather wallet. His fingers fumbled aggressively as he opened his banking application and pulled out his elite corporate credit cards. The heavy metal cards clattered against the mahogany table. "I have liquid capital," Austin babbled, his mind completely fracturing under the immense pressure. His eyes darted rapidly across his phone screen. "I have access to the offshore reserve lines. I can move the money right now. I can wire the funds before they freeze the accounts." He tapped the screen frantically, trying to initiate an international wire transfer to his getaway accounts. He prayed the transaction would clear, allowing him to escape the country. A bright, flashing red error message appeared across his display reading, "Account suspended." "You are too late," Gabrielle stated, watching him panic with cold, clinical detachment. "The federal government does not wait around when they are handed a verified whistleblower dossier exposing a multi-million-dollar international fraud syndicate." The IRS moved with extreme prejudice. As of 9 o'clock this morning, every single corporate credit card you hold has been entirely frozen by federal authorities. The Cayman Island accounts have been locked by international banking regulators. Your domestic commercial lines of credit have been completely terminated. You have absolutely zero access to liquid capital. You cannot buy a plane ticket. You cannot hire a defense attorney. You are utterly, entirely trapped. Austin stared at the red error message on his phone and the metal credit cards resting uselessly on the mahogany table. The reality of his total financial annihilation finally set in. He was no longer a wealthy corporate executive. He was a penniless criminal facing imminent federal prosecution. The arrogant swagger, the expensive Italian suits, the cruel jokes, they meant absolutely nothing anymore. He had thrown garbage at me on the front porch, believing his wealth made him a god. Now he was nothing but a broken, desperate man. He looked up at Gabrielle, tears of pure, terrified desperation streaming down his face. "Gabrielle, please," he begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic, wretched whine. "Please, you have to help me. You know the banking system better than anyone. You know how to negotiate with the federal auditors. We can fix this together. I will do whatever you want. I will give you anything. Just please do not let them send me to prison. I am your husband." Gabrielle did not show a single ounce of pity. She had spent years watching him inflict vicious cruelty on others, and she was completely immune to his manufactured, manipulative tears. She reached into her sleek designer bag and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. She held it by the corner, her perfectly manicured nails stark against the plain paper. "I do not want anything from you, Austin," Gabrielle said, her voice radiating absolute finality. "Because you have absolutely nothing left to give." She tossed the manila envelope onto the mahogany table. It slid across the polished wood and bumped directly into his useless frozen corporate credit cards. "Those are my aggressive, unilateral divorce filings," Gabrielle announced, making sure George and Veronica could hear every single word from the floor. "My legal team will file them at the county courthouse first thing tomorrow morning. I am citing severe financial abuse, criminal corporate negligence, and massive felony fraud. I am seeking immediate sole physical and legal custody of our son. I have already secured a protective restraining order preventing you from coming anywhere near our home or my child. You will never threaten me again." Austin let out a loud, agonizing sob, burying his face in his trembling hands. He was completely, entirely broken. He had lost his inheritance, his company, his freedom, and his family in the span of 30 agonizing minutes. Gabrielle reached her right hand over to her left. She gripped the massive, flawless diamond wedding ring Austin had purchased using stolen corporate funds. With a smooth, decisive motion, she slid the heavy platinum band off her finger. Austin had a half-empty cup of water resting near his spot on the table provided by the law firm reception staff earlier in the evening. Gabrielle held her hand directly over the crystal glass. She opened her fingers. The heavy diamond ring dropped. It hit the water with a sharp, definitive splash, sinking instantly to the bottom of the glass. The visual metaphor was flawless. His marriage, his wealth, his entire life had just sunk into a dark, toxic abyss from which he would never recover. "Have a nice life in federal prison," Austin, Gabrielle said, turning her back on him completely. She walked back over to my side, standing tall and perfectly unbothered, leaning slightly against my shoulder in a quiet display of unshakable solidarity. In that exact precise moment, the heavy oak doors of the top-floor conference room swung open with a loud, forceful crash. The timing was so perfect it felt orchestrated by the universe itself. A team of 8 individuals wearing tactical windbreakers marched into the room. The bright yellow letters printed boldly across their chests read IRSCID. The Internal Revenue Service criminal investigation agents had officially arrived. The Internal Revenue Service criminal investigation agents had officially arrived. The lead federal agent stepped forward, his heavy tactical boots thudding with menacing authority against the polished Italian marble floor of the reception area, before transitioning onto the plush, expensive carpet of the executive conference room. He surveyed the incredibly chaotic scene with the cold, practiced detachment of a man who had spent his entire career systematically dismantling the luxurious fake lives of arrogant white-collar criminals. He saw George firmly pinned to the floor by the specialized federal auditors, struggling uselessly against their superior strength. He saw Austin sobbing uncontrollably at the mahogany table, completely paralyzed by the sudden collapse of his reality. He saw Veronica curled in a torn emerald designer gown, choking and gasping for air after her own husband had just violently attempted to strangle her. The lead agent pulled a thick, heavy stack of federal arrest warrants from his tactical vest, the crisp paper making a sharp, terrifying sound in his hands. George Austin and Madison, the lead agent, announced, his deep voice booming with absolute, uncompromising federal authority that instantly silenced the remaining murmurs in the room. You are hereby placed under immediate arrest. The federal charges against you include massive corporate fraud, grand larceny wire fraud, identity forgery, and the operation of a highly illegal international tax evasion syndicate. Two heavily armed agents immediately flanked Austin. They grabbed his upper arms, yanking him aggressively up from his expensive leather chair with zero regard for his custom-tailored Italian suit. Austin let out a pathetic, high-pitched wail as the agent swiftly twisted his arms securely behind his back. The heavy steel handcuffs snapped around his wrists with a sharp metallic click that echoed loudly and definitively through the massive conference room. The golden child, the arrogant, illegitimate heir who had spent his entire life sincerely believing he was completely untouchable by the laws of basic human decency, was now sobbing hysterically. His terrified tears dripped onto the polished mahogany table, landing right next to his useless frozen corporate credit cards and his discarded platinum wedding ring. The agents holding George on the floor hauled the disgraced billionaire patriarch forcefully to his feet. George did not fight back anymore. The blinding homicidal rage that had driven him to brutally attack his wife just minutes ago had entirely evaporated, replaced entirely by the crushing, suffocating reality of a mandatory 20-year federal prison sentence. His thick wrists were secured in heavy steel cuffs. He stared blankly at the floorboards, his breathing ragged and shallow, looking like a broken, defeated shell of a man who had successfully lost his company, his wealth, his family, and his freedom in a single devastating hour. "Where is Madison?" the lead agent barked, looking directly at the sobbing Austin. Before Austin could stammer out a pathetic weeping response through his tears, the lead agent's shoulder radio crackled loudly with static. A clear voice from the field tactical team came through the external speaker reporting a highly secure operational status. "Target 3 is officially in custody," the radio voice confirmed for the entire room to hear. "We successfully breached the downtown luxury penthouse. Madison has been fully detained. We are currently seizing the Porsche Panamera, freezing the offshore Cayman Island trust accounts, and aggressively confiscating all luxury designer assets purchased with embezzled corporate funds." She is crying heavily and frantically requesting a lawyer, but the premises are entirely secure. Austin slumped forward, his knees buckling entirely under the sheer crushing weight of the synchronized federal strike. He was only kept upright by the strong, unyielding grip of the federal agents holding his arms. The entire fake empire had been flawlessly and simultaneously dismantled across the city. The hidden offshore accounts were entirely gone. The luxury sports cars were heavily impounded. The fraudulent getaway money was permanently frozen. The execution was absolute, uncompromising, and totally irreversible. Every single illegal asset they had stolen to build their arrogant high society facade had been entirely stripped away by the relentless grinding machinery of the federal government. They had absolutely no leverage left. They had no expensive corporate lawyers on retainer because their bank accounts were locked. They were completely exposed, standing entirely naked in the ruins of their own blinding arrogance, finally facing the devastating, terrifying consequences of their decades of unchecked greed and relentless cruelty. Veronica had not been explicitly named on the primary arrest warrants for the corporate fraud and offshore embezzlement, but her reality was equally, undeniably catastrophic. She was left entirely destitute, completely stripped of the $50 million dynasty trust, and permanently tied to a violent husband who had just tried to brutally strangle her to death. As the federal agents began forcefully pulling George and Austin toward the heavy oak doors to transport them directly to federal holding cells, the sheer blinding panic of absolute poverty crashed down upon the former high society matriarch. She realized with terrifying clarity that her sprawling suburban mansions, her elite country club memberships, and her endless designer shopping sprees were completely permanently gone. She had absolutely no money, no home, and zero social standing left in the city of Chicago. Veronica frantically scrambled across the carpeted floor on her hands and knees. Her torn, ruined emerald gown dragged pathetically behind her as she crawled desperately toward where I stood next to Gabrielle. She completely abandoned any lingering shreds of her elitist, arrogant dignity. She reached out with her trembling, deeply bruised hands and aggressively grabbed the ankles of my bespoke midnight blue suit, her manicured fingers clawing desperately at the expensive, polished leather of my shoes. "Grace, please!" Veronica sobbed, her voice a wretched, hysterical shriek that echoed piercingly off the glass walls of the conference room. "Please, you absolutely have to help us. You have the $50 million trust fund now. You are the sole legal heir to the entire grandfather estate. You have the massive financial power to stop this nightmare. You have to post their federal bail. You have to hire the absolute best defense attorneys in the city to keep your father and your brother out of a federal penitentiary." She looked up at me, her expensive makeup completely ruined and smeared dark tears streaming down her bruised red neck. "We are your family, Grace. I am your mother. I gave birth to you. I raised you under my roof. You cannot just stand there in your tailored suit and watch these agents take your own flesh and blood away in steel handcuffs. You have to show some maternal love, some basic family loyalty. Please use the Dynasty Trust money to save us. I am begging you on my hands and knees." Austin, hearing his mother begging and groveling on the floor, suddenly stopped dragging his feet against the federal agents. He violently turned his head toward me, his face twisted in a mask of absolute, pathetic, unfiltered desperation. The cruel, vicious bully, who had laughed sadistically while throwing rotting garbage at me, was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, weeping child. "Grace, please save me!" Austin openly wept, thick tears and snot running freely down his pale face. "I am sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for absolutely everything I have ever done to you. I did not mean a single word of what I said on the porch. The garbage bag was just a stupid, thoughtless joke. The DNA test was just a massive, horrible misunderstanding. I was just severely stressed about the overwhelming company debt. Please do not let them put me in a federal penitentiary. I will not survive in there. You are my sister. You have all the limitless money now. Pay them off. Tell Mr. Henderson to officially drop the interim penalty. I will give you whatever you want. I will work for you as an assistant. Just please, Grace, have some basic human mercy on your brother." George remained entirely silent in his heavy steel handcuffs, but he slowly turned his head to look directly at me. His dark eyes were filled with a hollow, desperate, agonizing pleading, silently begging me to use my newly acquired billionaire status to magically rescue the very man who had starved, isolated, and verbally abused me for 33 consecutive years. They genuinely expected me to easily crumble. They expected the deep conditioned trauma of a desperate daughter, desperately craving her toxic family's validation, to entirely override the cold, hard analytical logic of my professional appraiser mind. They foolishly believed that because we shared the exact same biological markers, I was permanently genetically obligated to endure their endless abuse and sacrifice my own hard-earned sanity to protect them from the devastating consequences of their own malicious, intentional felonies. They desperately wanted me to be their disposable human shield one last time. I looked down at Veronica's shaking manicured hands clutching desperately at the leather of my shoes. I looked at Austin sobbing hysterically, his arms pinned backward by the uncompromising federal agents. I looked at George, the utterly disgraced billionaire patriarch, completely broken and facing the miserable end of his life behind cold federal bars. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel any lingering sorrow, any guilt, or any shred of familial obligation. The icy, untouchable analytical resolve that had carried me entirely through the grueling warfare of the past month solidified into absolute unbreakable permanence. I took a slow, highly deliberate step backward smoothly, forcing Veronica's desperate hands to slide entirely off my shoes and hit the carpeted floorboards. Family members do not throw heavy bags of rotting garbage at their daughters on their birthdays. I stated, my voice radiating a pure, unfiltered, terrifying disgust that cut cleanly through their pathetic, wretched crying like a perfectly sharpened surgical blade. Mothers do not sit by and smile proudly while their children are financially starved, professionally sabotaged, and publicly humiliated in front of arriving guests. Fathers do not actively forge their own daughter's signature to maliciously frame them for $5 million in toxic corporate debt. I looked directly into Austin's terrified, weeping, bloodshot eyes. You aggressively demanded scientific proof of who truly belonged in this family. I continued, my tone completely merciless and utterly devoid of warmth. You desperately wanted to execute a flawless legal excision. You bought that commercial DNA kit with your own money. You forcefully shoved it into my hands on the freezing porch. You proudly paid the commercial courier to severely expedite the federal laboratory processing. You did this entirely to yourself, Austin. You and George signed your own inescapable federal death warrants the exact second you handed me that genetic test on the porch. I merely stood back, watched you work, and allowed you to activate the precise mechanism of your own absolute destruction. Veronica let out a long, agonizing, ear-piercing wail, collapsing entirely against the floorboards, sobbing uncontrollably into the plush carpet as the absolute crushing finality of my unyielding rejection destroyed her absolute last shred of delusional hope. I have zero maternal love for a vicious woman who passed off illegitimate children as golden heirs while actively abusing her only true bloodline, I said, looking down at her writhing, pathetic form with cold detachment. And I have absolutely zero loyalty to a fake family of arrogant, incompetent thieves. Do not ever attempt to speak to me again. I turned my back on them completely. I did not wait to watch the federal agents forcefully drag them out of the executive room. I smoothly adjusted my bespoke midnight blue suit jacket, looking over at Gabrielle, who offered me a fiercely proud, entirely victorious nod of absolute solidarity. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, with severe professional grace, opening the heavy oak doors of the conference room to completely clear our path to freedom. Together, the three of us walked out of the top-floor executive suite, our footsteps echoing with absolute untouchable power. Behind us, the heavy oak doors slowly swung shut, but they could not entirely block out the pathetic, wretched, agonizing screams of my abusers echoing endlessly down the hallway as the federal agents finally hauled them away in heavy steel handcuffs. The toxic fake empire was officially dead, and I was exactly the one who held the matches. The toxic fake empire was officially dead, and I was exactly the one who held the matches. Exactly 1 month later, the massive, sprawling headquarters of Apex Distribution was entirely liquidated under the severe, unyielding supervision of the federal bankruptcy court. The grand illusion was completely dismantled piece by piece. Federal asset seizure teams arrived with fleets of heavy transport trucks and stripped the warehouses bare. The imported mahogany conference tables, the luxury executive chairs, and the expensive artwork were all auctioned off to pay the massive restitution fines owed to the defrauded commercial creditors. The corporate logo George had so proudly plastered across the building was violently scraped off the glass facade, leaving behind nothing but empty, transparent windows. The federal justice system moved with a terrifying, ruthless efficiency when handed a perfectly constructed whistleblower dossier. Austin and George stood side by side in a sterile federal courtroom wearing matching bright orange jumpsuits. Their expensive Italian suits and custom leather shoes were permanently gone. They were no longer arrogant billionaires dictating terms to wealthy investors. They were convicted felons facing the absolute destruction of their freedom. The federal judge did not show them a single ounce of leniency. Citing their massive international tax evasion syndicate, the brazen identity forgery, and their complete lack of remorse, the judge brought the heavy wooden gavel down with a resounding crack. Austin and George were both sentenced to 7 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Austin openly wept as the bailiffs dragged him out of the courtroom, while George simply stared at the floor, completely broken and entirely hollowed out. Veronica faced a different but equally devastating prison of her own making. She was left absolutely entirely destitute. Without the protection of the Dynasty Trust, and with all marital assets seized by the federal government, she was forcefully evicted from her sprawling suburban estate. She moved into a tiny, damp, one-bedroom apartment in a decaying industrial neighborhood. She frantically tried to call her wealthy high society friends, begging for loans or invitations to stay in their guest houses. Every single one of her calls was immediately blocked. The elite country club socialites completely shunned her, treating her like a highly contagious disease. She was forced to sell her remaining cheap jewelry just to afford basic groceries, living out the rest of her days in total pathetic isolation, completely erased from the elite world she worshipped. Madison suffered the most brutal reality check of them all. The spoiled golden child who had never worked a single day in her life watched in horror as federal agents impounded her $120,000 Porsche Panamera. Her Cayman Island accounts were permanently frozen and seized. Without her fraudulent corporate credit cards, she was suddenly buried under a mountain of crushing personal debt. The designer boutiques she used to frequent banned her from their premises. Stripped of her fake wealth, Madison was forced to trade her expensive silk dresses for a cheap polyester uniform. She secured a minimum wage job working the deep fryer at a fast food restaurant just outside the city limits. She spent her days scrubbing greasy floors and taking orders from angry customers, her arrogant entitlement entirely beaten out of her by the grueling, unforgiving reality of actual hard work. She went home every single night to a tiny roach-infested studio apartment, crying until her eyes were swollen, completely unable to comprehend how her perfect, luxurious life had vanished overnight. While they burned in the ashes of their own consequences, I officially took absolute, unshielded control of the prime commercial land. The $50 million Dynasty Trust was fully transferred into my name. I did not sell the property to developers for a quick payout. I did not run away. I utilized my elite federal certifications and the massive capital reserves to completely restructure the entire physical foundation of the estate. I founded Legacy Asset Management, a premier independent appraisal and commercial investment firm. We did not just evaluate properties. We actively acquired, rehabilitated, and managed high-tier logistical hubs across the Midwest. My very first executive decision as the founder and chief executive officer was to hire the most brilliant analytical mind I knew. Gabrielle officially joined Legacy Asset Management as my chief compliance officer. Her divorce from Austin was finalized with brutal efficiency, granting her absolute sole legal and physical custody of her son Leo. Free from the suffocating racist toxicity of her former marriage, Gabrielle flourished into an absolute corporate titan. We completely renovated the old Apex headquarters, transforming it into a sleek, highly modernized fortress of transparent finance and elite asset management. We employed hundreds of hardworking people, offering them fair wages and robust pension plans, completely reversing the toxic, exploitative corporate culture George had fostered for decades. Together, Gabrielle and I built a massive, widely respected empire. We operated with absolute, unbreakable integrity and relentless, uncompromising competence. We did not need to falsify quarterly reports or forge signatures to secure funding. Our reputation for flawless, independent appraisals and razor-sharp risk management attracted the largest commercial developers in the country. We secured massive, lucrative contracts simply because we were undeniably the absolute best in the industry. The toxic boys' club mentality that had previously dominated the Chicago real estate market was completely shattered by two fiercely intelligent women who refused to back down from any challenge. 6 months after the federal raid, I stood in my new executive corner office located on the 50th floor of a prestigious downtown high-rise. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a magnificent, breathtaking view of the sprawling Chicago skyline. The city that had once felt like a freezing hostile prison designed to constantly reject me, now felt like my own personal kingdom. The sun was shining brightly, casting a brilliant golden light across the metallic skyscrapers and the deep blue waters of Lake Michigan. Resting squarely on the center of my massive polished obsidian desk was the latest issue of Forbes magazine. The glossy cover featured a high-resolution professional photograph of Gabrielle and me standing confidently in front of our newly acquired commercial facilities. The bold headline printed beneath our names read, "The New Titans of Chicago Real Estate. How Legacy Asset Management Built a billion-dollar empire on absolute integrity." My name was no longer a discarded punchline. It was a highly respected, deeply feared corporate brand. The article specifically praised our ruthless dedication to transparency and our complete refusal to engage in the shady backroom dealing that plagued the commercial sector. The sleek digital phone on my desk suddenly chimed, breaking the quiet, serene silence of my corner office. I walked over and pressed the flashing green button, putting the call on the high-definition speaker. Legacy Asset Management Office of the CEO. Grace speaking. I answered, my voice smooth, perfectly modulated, and projecting absolute effortless power. "Grace, thank goodness I finally got through to your direct line." An eager, slightly breathless voice echoed from the speaker. "It is Richard Kensington. We met briefly at the Prime Cut Steakhouse a few months ago." I recognized the name and the arrogant corporate undertone instantly. Richard Kensington was the lead commercial developer who had been sitting at the table with George and Austin, ready to blindly sign the fraudulent $20 million fire sale contract. He was the man who had watched my family aggressively humiliate me and call me an illegitimate bastard without saying a single word in my defense. "Hello, Richard," I replied, keeping my tone dangerously neutral. "What can I do for you today?" "I was just reading your incredible feature in Forbes magazine this morning," Kensington stated, his voice dripping with desperate, obsequious flattery. "I must admit I was absolutely blown away by your staggering acquisition metrics and your flawless compliance record. My development conglomerate is currently looking to partner with a top-tier firm to manage a massive new portfolio of industrial properties hitting the market next quarter. We are prepared to offer Legacy Asset Management an exclusive, highly lucrative multi-million-dollar contract. We would be absolutely honored to do business with a visionary like you." He was sweating. I could hear the desperate, eager panic in his voice. He realized he had previously dismissed and ignored a woman who was now completely out of his league, and he was frantically trying to attach his firm to my explosive, skyrocketing success. He wanted to profit off the very empire he had almost unknowingly helped my father steal from me. I looked down at the Forbes magazine cover. I looked at the powerful, unbothered woman staring back at me from the glossy page. I thought about the freezing November night when I stood on a dirty limestone porch, covered in rotting garbage, gripping a commercial DNA kit, while my family laughed at my pain. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated terror in Austin's eyes when the federal agent slapped the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists and dragged him away forever. I picked up my ceramic mug from the desk and took a slow, deliberate sip of my warm black coffee. The rich, roasted flavor grounded me in the perfect, absolute reality of my total victory. "I appreciate the offer, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, merciless register that left absolutely zero room for negotiation. "However, I only conduct business with individuals who have the intelligence to verify their facts." I did not wait for his shocked, sputtering response. I did not give him a single second to backpedal or apologize for his past ignorance. I reached out and firmly pressed the red button on the console, disconnecting the call and cutting the line completely dead. I turned away from the desk and walked back toward the massive glass windows overlooking the brilliant, glowing city. I had completely, permanently excised the toxic infection from my life. I had turned their cruel genetic joke into a $50 million weapon, and I had used it to completely eradicate their fake existence. I did not just survive their abuse, I conquered it. I stood entirely alone at the absolute pinnacle of my industry, breathing in the crisp, clean air of total, undisputed freedom. It was an absolute, untouchable victory. This story powerfully illustrates the transformative nature of reclaiming your own narrative. Grace spent her life internalizing her family's toxic, fabricated reality, one where she was the mistake. When they pushed her to the brink, she didn't just walk away. She used the very weapons they handed her, their arrogance and the DNA test, to dismantle their entire empire. The core lesson is that true strength often requires breaking free from the expectations of those who abuse you, no matter their title. You are not defined by the roles toxic people assign you. Have you ever had to redefine your own worth against someone else's expectations? Share your experience in the comments below.